Good afternoon, everyone. The special meeting of the Sacramento City Council will come to order. Would the clerk please call the roll so that we can establish a quorum?
Thank you. Councilmember Ashby? Councilmember Harris? Councilmember Hanson? Councilmember Carr? Councilmember Jennings? Councilmember Guerra? Councilmember Chenier? And Mayor Steinberg.
Beggarberg is fine.
And we expect Councilmember Warren momentarily.
That's okay.
Thank you.
I am here, and Councilman Warner will be here in a moment. Let us begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd like to ask our Homeless Services Coordinator in the city, Emily Halkin, to please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, I want to welcome everybody again to this special meeting, which is today centered, of course, on the issue of our continuing effort to create shelter and housing options for the people who are homeless here in Sacramento. And I want to begin with just a couple of comments, and I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Halkin and our Housing and Redevelopment Agency for their presentation. Of course, we will hear from all members of the public. If you haven't signed up yet, please do so that we can make sure that we call you. First of all, I want to say this. No final decision is being made tonight on any particular site, maybe with the exception of the downtown site that was the subject of press conference last week. All of the other sites, we are giving direction to the city management. It's depending on the will of the council and our homeless services office to begin the preparatory work so that we can open more beds for more people. But all of the particular sites would have to come back to the city council for approval around the contracts and around the specifics of each of those projects. So I just wanted to say that to folks. I know there are folks from various neighborhoods here tonight from various communities and constituencies, just to put that into a little bit of context. The second thing I want to say is that the city is fully committed to making this unacceptable problem that exists not just in our city, but actually many places in the state of California better. For the one thing that we all can agree on is that homelessness is a problem not just to shrug our shoulders about, to hope that it gets better, and to do little or nothing about. That if we're going to make a difference, we have to actually work to get people off the streets. And for those who are concerned about the site of any of these shelters, low barrier, medium barrier, high barrier triage centers in their neighborhoods or adjacent to their neighborhoods, it is important that I think that you challenge yourself with this question. What is your answer? What do you seek to do? How do you seek to alleviate homelessness in your part of the city? For this is no longer just a downtown problem. It's predominant in some parts of town, but it's not exclusive to any part of town. It's okay to say no, and it's okay to have concerns. That's very legitimate. But I would urge you to think deep about the answer to that question. What would you do? And how do we deal with the homeless problem in and around your community? That's the basis of a constructive discussion and will help guide us towards the right set of actions. Thank you. Let me turn it over now to Emily for a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mayor Steinberg, members of the council. My name is Emily Halkin. I'm the Homeless Services Coordinator with the city, and I'll be presenting tonight with Christine Weichert from SHRA. Recognizing the important role that shelters can play and should play in preventing and ending homelessness, the city has been actively working on sheltering for as long as I've been here, for over 4 years now. I just want to quickly remind you of the things we've done to date. So in 2015, you created my division, and we started focusing primarily on street outreach in coordination with Sacramento Steps Forward. And we also started renegotiating, working more directly with some of our traditional shelter providers and trying to improve some of the outcomes in those programs. In 2016, the city, and with our partnership with Sutter Health, piloted some funds to extend operations at 2 of our traditional shelters in the River District, the North A Street Shelter and the Salvation Army Shelter, in a goal of trying to alleviate some of the impacts on the streets in that community. And then at the end of 2016, when Mayor Steinberg first came on board, in the midst of an especially harsh winter, you authorized the opening of low-barrier warming centers, independent of sort of our traditional weather approaches to warming centers. And this was really our first time as a city is experimenting lowering barriers to access and serving people with their partners, pets, and possessions. But the warming centers didn't provide wraparound services or rehousing. In 2017, as you will recall, we were awarded the Whole Person Care Funds, which, while they don't fund shelter, really changed the way that we engage with folks on the streets, and it changed the way we thought about outreach and engagement, from casting a net very widely to really focusing on the most vulnerable, the folks who are closest to death, the folks who are struggling the most with addiction and other issues on the street. We also, in 2017, began a partnership that continues today with the Wind Youth Services to match some funds to help them open a shelter program in Oak Park. And in 2017, at the very end of 2017, we opened what we now call the Railroad Triage Shelter. In 2018, in addition to maintaining our investments and actually really changing and rethinking Railroad, we learned a lot along the way. We also increased some partnerships with the LGBT Center to help them open a new transitional program, which we continue that investment today. And then most notably in 2018, the governor announced what we now call the HEAP funds, which brought over $18 million of funding to our community, 5.6 directly to the city. And in October, the council approved a spending plan for that, which is some of what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And then finally, we're only a couple months into 2019, but you have done some substantial things already. You allocated through the mid-year process $15.7 million of one-time Measure U funds from leftover, as well as $1 million to focus on sheltering needs for women and families. And you also, in March, authorized our first investment with the HEAP dollars for the Ethan Way shelter. And tonight, I'm previewing a little bit what you're going to see tonight. Hopefully tonight you are going to authorize investments in 2 new youth sheltering programs, also using the HEAP funds. So this afternoon's actions focus on prioritizing projects using what we currently have available, and then starting to plan for projects with additional funds as they become available. The table on top in green shows the amount of funds that are currently available in my division's budget from the first round of HEAP, from the city allocations you've already made, and from some private funds, and this totals about $25.6 million. The bottom table, shown in gray, is from the mayor's presentation in February, where he contemplated some aspirational goals of increasing this pot, including a second round of funding from the state and some private fundraising. While these dollars are not currently available, and today's action won't contemplate committing those dollars, we have some recommendations for prioritizing projects when and if these funds become available. So with the $25.6 million that we currently have available, you already have made some commitments for just over $14 million of that. So I'm going to show you what you've committed to. First, about $1 million, just under 5% for administration. You have already authorized $600,000 to expand the downtown street team in 3 areas in the central city, as well as the Broadway WX corridor, and they are operational today. We allocated $1 million in the mid-year for rehousing and sheltering programs for focusing on women and or families, and we expect to have that RFQ out in the next couple of months. We also have in our pot $1.4 million from HEAP that is intended to go to support existing shelters. All of those traditional shelters, most of which are in the River District, we want to invest in those as well, and we want to enhance their services and enhance the throughput in those shelters. There is $600,000 exclusively set aside primarily from HEAP for youth sheltering programs. Not only this is a requirement of HEAP, it's also a commitment and I think a priority of our city and our region as a whole. I'm going to preview tonight. It's on consent, and so I wanted the opportunity to highlight tonight what I'm hoping you're going to approve on consent tonight is the support of $164,000 of funding for 1 year to stand up a 12-bed youth shelter here in the Central City in partnership with the LGBT Center. An additional $440,000 to pilot a host home program, again in partnership with the LGBT Center, that can serve up to 20 youth at a time. This is a really new and innovative approach to sheltering we've never seen in our community, and it allows us to engage with well-meaning citizens and people throughout the community to take people into their homes. And because these are on consent tonight, and I know there won't be an opportunity to talk about it, the folks from the LGBT Center are here today if you want to ask any questions of them. And then finally, the last chunk that has been encumbered from our $25 million is about $9.4 million that you allocated in March towards the Ethan Way shelter. This includes the construction plus 2 years of operations and mitigations. So this leaves us with about $11.6 million unencumbered and available to spend on new projects. So for the remaining $11.6 million, staff has been exploring 7 projects that are laid out here and are detailed in much more detail in Exhibit A to your staff report. 3 of them are sited shelters. 2 of them, the South Area Shelter and the Broadway X Alhambra, we've got to figure out how we're going to call this, would be proposed to be using a sprung structure and serve approximately 100 people at a time. The cost estimates in the staff report are early estimates for construction, operation, mitigation, and rehousing for the 2 years. The third sited shelter is the Capitol Park Hotel, which we're going to talk about quite a bit in a little bit, and SHRA will provide more detail. In addition to these 3 sited shelters, staff has also been asked to look at the possibilities of using scattered site approaches, and the proposal does include about 50 of those at a cost of just over $2 million. And our idea here is we could use scattered site to focus in areas where there aren't sited shelters and or in areas of higher economic incomes so that we can make sure we get diversity throughout our city. And then finally, there are 3 sort of smaller projects that are complementary to shelters, but in and of themselves aren't necessarily triage shelter. One is what I'm calling a 24/7 safe interim shelter, which would really be a quick access, low barrier, but also low service place for folks who, in a moment of crisis, can be transported to and then triaged into something more appropriate. And then one is to pay for a potential pilot of storage lockers, which we've had some conversations with some of you here and there. So in total, these 7 projects, all in, total $35 million, and we have $11 million available. So given the funding that is available, we are recommending for tonight's action, or today's action, funding 3 of these projects with the 11.6 that's available. Those are detailed in what I'm calling the Tier 1 table. The first priority is the Capitol Park Hotel, which Christine will talk about in just a minute. Note that the cost here in my table are only the operational cost, including the operations that SHRA will manage, but also mitigation in partnership with the city for our increased police patrols. Additional funds for the acquisition and relocation are not shown in this chart, but are detailed in the staff report. After the Capitol Park Hotel is funded, we anticipate having about $1 million available, and we recommend using this to stand up the first 20 of our scattered site shelters. We recommend that both because it's scalable and it's something we can do quickly, but certainly open to other ways to use that last $1 million. And then the final thing is a very small administrative funding to allow us to pay for some site search activities that our staff have been hard at work at. Tier 2 projects, my second table there, are should additional funds become available. Should we get additional money from the state, additional private money, any other funds become available, we then recommend prioritizing these projects in this order as shown, starting with the South Area Rehousing Shelter. The cost here include both the construction and, again, 2 years of operation, rehousing, and mitigation. And you can sort of see that the next priority would be the Broadway X Alhambra rehousing shelter, additional scattered site shelters, and then on to some of the smaller projects. So tonight, this afternoon's recommendation specifically is to ask you to adopt the homeless funding plan that's attached to the resolution that details this approach, these funding allocations, and then to authorize some funding specifically for the Capitol Park Hotel, and then directing SHRA to return with some project-specific documents. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Christine, who will provide some detail on Capitol Park.
Good afternoon, Christine Weckert with SHRA. So, as most of you probably know, Capitol Park Hotel was built in 1912 and is currently operating as a 108-unit single-room occupancy residential hotel at corners of 9th and L Street with approximately 50% vacancy rate right now. The owners of Capitol Park are in contract to sell the property to Mercy Housing. The city would provide a $13.3 million loan to SHRA, who would then provide a loan to Mercy Housing for $10 million for acquisition and $3.3 million for relocation costs. Mercy's relocation consultant will permanently relocate the existing residents, and it's anticipated the relocation will take approximately 3 months, but it could take longer depending on the resident. I want to reassure the council that SHRA will review and approve the relocation plan, and all residents will be provided ample assistance. I should also say that $13.3 million loan will be repaid in approximately 18 months when permanent financing for the Capitol Park Hotel is realized. The city will lease the site from Mercy Housing and contract with SHRA to oversee a temporary shelter. City and SHRA staff will work together to determine the shelter operator. The Capitol Park Hotel will provide temporary shelter with up to 180 beds, as I said, for approximately 18 months. About 140 of the units have bathrooms, and those that occupy the remaining 40 units will have access to common area bathrooms. In addition to the acquisition and relocation loan, approximately, as is on the screen there, $10.3 million is needed for immediate repairs, property management, shelter operations, security, and maintenance costs at the site. We will be returning to City Council for approval of the loan and administrative agreements. In addition, we will immediately begin reaching out to the Downtown Partnership and other stakeholders to discuss the shelter's target population and occupancy strategy. And that concludes my presentation, and we're available to answer any questions you may have.
Hey, thank you. I know that we have comments and questions from the City Council. I might do this a little bit differently this time. And we have 14 people to testify, but I think I'd like to have a couple stages of opening this up for the City Council first to ask questions about the specifics so that the public essentially has the full information, even more information about the range of things that we are talking about here. So I'm going to do that before we take the public testimony. I know I have some questions, but I can wait, and I'll start with Councilmember Jeff Harris.
Thank you, Mayor. Christine, I do have a question. A few community members have reached out to me worried about the relocation of the residents at Capitol Park, wanting assurances that they won't themselves become homeless. So that's kind of out there and on people's minds. I know you did a lot of relocation for the Twin Rivers project, but people don't have a clear idea of where the residents of Capitol Park will go. So can you kind of sketch out what that would look like?
Sure. So the relocation consultant will work with every individual to see what their needs are, where they like to be relocated. A few years ago, we did this with the Marshall Hotel, and we know how long that takes because you want to make sure everyone goes to exactly where they want to go. It could be that they remain downtown. It could be they relocated somewhere else in Sacramento City or County. It could be they want to be relocated elsewhere, but they will definitely be assisted with not only finding that location, but moving their belongings and any other rent compensation that's needed.
I mean, we obviously don't want anybody to fall into homelessness because of relocation. So, I mean, do you have any assurance that, we can move up to 90 people, I guess? Is that the correct number?
I'm sure that they'll all be relocated, and if it takes longer, it will take as long as we need to make sure they get to where they needed to be. So there's no time limit. We would like to relocate people as quickly as possible to get them resettled, but if they need to stay there for longer, then they'll be welcome.
And in terms of using the site itself, there's no requirement that we try to fill 180 beds quickly. I mean, it seems to me that the best idea would be to ramp up slowly, to use available space. About 50% is available currently.
Right.
And to sort of test the water slowly. Is that how SHRA envisions running Capitol Park Hotel? To navigate people there slowly, to prove the model, to work with the provider and make sure that things are running well?
Well, one of our goals is obviously to try and get as many people off the street as soon as possible. But within that, we know that it's just going to take time. So really, our desire to ramp up quickly is kind of mediated by the fact that we have to get parts of the hotel ready. So there are some resources that are included in this funding that allows us to do some of the slight remodeling that is necessary for it to operate as a shelter. So that does mean that it's going to take us some time to get to the 180 beds over time. It won't happen immediately.
Okay, thank you for that. I just wanted to make a statement. This project came to light because I was looking for a motel to turn into permanent supportive housing with a low-income developer. It turned out not to be a particularly advantageous site, but to the credit of SHRA, when asked, they came forward with a list of hotels and motels that were underperforming that we might consider as possible projects, and it was really great. It was great information, and it helped us kind of sort through what our possibilities were, so I wanted to thank you for that. Mr. Mayor, at this point, I have a lot to say about the railroad shelter, but I don't know how you
Why don't you save that until after the public testimony, because I think we
that
kind of
makes sense.
want to wrap this up. I want to, there are a lot of people to thank, certainly about different projects and different sites, but on the motel conversion issue, I want to just do my thank yous quickly. First of all, to you, Councilmember Harris, for having this original idea, and you're right, we talked about it first in portions of your district. For different reasons, didn't work out, but every good idea is seeded by somebody. Thank you. And Councilmember Hanson, get to you in a minute. Thank you for stepping up without hesitation and being a major part of the solution. 180 beds, really. And SHRA on this, I want to thank. As I said at the press conference last week, I've been known to wear my passions on my sleeve once in a while. And we've had some exchanges across the dais, all in the furtherance of what I call the good of the order, to try to make us all better. And when you were asked to take on this challenge, man, you've taken it on. And what's significant about this, and I can steal Steve's thunder here, but is that we want to talk in a few minutes about the operational costs. I have some questions. But the construction cost for the triage piece of this will end up being virtually zero. Because it's turning into a permanent supportive housing project, between the tax credits, the mental health, no place like home resources, the other resources, it's zero to us in terms of this general fund and the 15.7. That's really noteworthy. So I want to say publicly, thank you to you for your outstanding work in bringing this forward in such an expeditious way. I personally appreciate it, and I know the community does as well. Okay? So, Councilmember Hanson.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I have fewer comments now because they went first, which I always appreciate.
No, I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good. This is a special day for a variety of reasons. Since we're doing a little bit of thank yous, I've got a couple questions that may help people who are going to speak, but I did want to thank not only SHRA and my colleagues and city staff, but I see Stephen Dodds from Mercy Housing here. And it was actually them who want to rehab this structure that is Capitol Park Hotel, which is one of our SRO properties that has never been upgraded. It's still in what I would call a vintage state. And it really desperately needs these improvements. And through the No Place Like Home state grant process, which the mayor helped create, did create, not just helped, did. We have applied for those funds to turn these units at the end of 18 or 24 months into permanent supportive housing. So those will be restricted rent levels, those will be intensive services, and it's much like a permanent form of what we're trying to do in the interim, which is this triage facility model. And so SHRA knows this model because we've done it at 7th and H, which is also nearby, and Mercy built that project from ground up, and it has been a model. And so I trust that they'll do a great job here. But my colleague Jeff asked about relocation, and certainly that's on top of mind because we don't want to cause unintended harm. I do know that Mercy would have had to relocate people out to do the construction, so in a way, we've just brought that question forward on a more immediate timeline. But is it the procedure of SHRA and the consultants, and I heard you say this, Christine, but I want to ask the question very specifically, to allow people to decline a placement that may be identified if it's not in the community they want to live in. So let's say a resident at Capitol Park Hotel, and this was former Mayor Fargo's question, if they want to remain downtown, are they able to say, I don't want to live in Citrus Heights or in East Sacramento, if Jeff should find a unit there? Can they say that and then say, I want to wait until you find a unit in downtown for me at Riverview Plaza or one of the other SHRA properties?
Yes, so they'll be presented with, they'll be interviewed, asked where they'd like to go. The relocation consultant will try to find them a location near where they want to be. They'll be given a number of options, places to choose from. The relocation consultants often literally get them in a car or, and drive them to that location to see if they like it. If they don't like it, they're not required to go there. So they will keep working with them until they find a location that the...
So it's virtually at their choice. Because we have time here, they have time to figure that out.
Yes.
The other question is really about this ramp up of our shelter or triage facility and the ramp down at Capitol Park Hotel. And as you work on a operator in the short term, I know we've talked about this privately and it's been mentioned, but I anticipate some overlap for current residents that if we begin, because it's half full right now, we have 90 beds available, that we could organize this in a way that we could give them time that if they're more, if they have different needs, if they have more significant needs, that they could stay longer at Capitol Park Hotel, right?
Absolutely.
And that we can, essentially we have a lot of flexibility given that the construction project is staged out sufficient enough time and we have enough capacity that there's not going to be some fell swoop where you just say you have to leave. And that gives me comfort, right? Is that right, Christine or Lachelle? And that gives me comfort, and I think the mayor and the advocates who stood with us from ACT and from the Sacramento Housing Alliance and Sacramento Coalition to End Homelessness, that we are both thinking about the people who are unsheltered, but also the people who will be impacted by our creation of this triage facility. So that really helps a lot. I will say, as we get into this, there are questions about how the mitigation is structured, because it's different here. I think those funds are going to route through SHRA. And so I think Councilmember Chenier created a process, and I just want to see if we're going to replicate that, but that we have a community stakeholder group to sort of ensure communication between stakeholders, and that we can continue this process, because these are all different. This is a fairly large facility, and when I look at Emily's chart, I see 10.3 million, and to me that sounds like a lot, but when you see 180 beds, you realize that if we have 24 months at 180 people, it's about $2,400 a month for intensive services and everything else. And I think that is a very reasonable deal compared to how expensive typical shelter beds can be, even without those services. So it's very efficient use of money, I think, is a very important point to make. Finally, have we begun to think through the referral process? Because we have about 100 people in the central city who we've known for years are unsheltered and should have priority. Have we begun to think about the referral process here, Emily or Christine or Lachelle, so that we can give priority to the residents who are already here in downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods?
That is definitely one of our next steps. We have given some thought to it, obviously, and had some conversations, but we really want to involve the stakeholders and our, possibly even the operator, the shelter operator. We'll see. Hopefully they can get them on very quickly in those discussions as well. We'll talk about outreach.
Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but this is a really critical question for my constituents, my residents.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think it's also critical to know who the target population is so you can design the front door correctly. So we'll be working with SHRA once to hone in and to provide our suggestions about that.
Yeah. And I think that leads perfectly into my last question, which is we haven't yet said who the target population is here, but I've made some comments in the media about people who have chronic or serious illness, who are medically fragile, being a priority for some of the rooms, potentially couples, families if that were appropriate, and then obviously single men and single women as part of it. And so as we look at shelter providers, I think the healthcare capacity of those providers is really important. Some of the people who we hear Bob Erlenbush talk about who pass away on the streets from being unsheltered in their chronic and concurrent medical conditions, we really have a chance through this Capitol Park site to help stabilize them, potentially keep them in a better state of health mentally and physically, and to save their lives. And I don't want to be too provocative about that, but I think this is a really unique opportunity that even the sprung shelters don't provide. And so I want to make sure we have a really thoughtful population sort of selection process to try to meet those various needs. But Mayor, thank you for your unbridled support for doing this and thoughtfulness, and this is smart because we get paid back the capital costs through the final project. And again, we wouldn't be here without Mercy Housing saying they were willing to be on this journey with us. And so they really deserve a lot of credit.
And thank you, Steve. And I want to thank the city manager and the city treasurer as well, because they had to, everything's about creativity in this field here, and to provide essentially a bridge construction loan for us so that we can get possession of the property knowing that we're going to get paid back. And it took that kind of quick maneuvering here that allows us to open this up much sooner than later. So thank you. Okay, thank you. Councilmember Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't take much time because this is pretty much a no-brainer. This is, the financing really makes a lot of sense. And the people who put this together deserve a lot of credit for coming up with this financing scheme. But I do have a couple of questions. On this shelter, is this a low barrier? What kind of barrier shelter are we looking at?
TBD, right?
Yes.
Sorry.
Spell that out in English for us.
But we're going to be working on that and getting back to you on exactly what.
Be determined.
Yes.
And Emily, is this, with this shelter, are we planning to get people through and on to permanent supportive housing in 4 months?
My understanding is that the budget, the operational budget that's included in the staff report includes rehousing. I'm not sure if SHRA can add more.
The original strategy kind of said that we thought we could accelerate the rate of getting people into the shelter and out of the shelter to permanent supportive housing in 4 months in order to meet the goal of having 2,000 people off the street within a year or two.
Who said that?
You did.
I'm kidding. I know I did.
I mean, what I can say is that the cost estimates that were used for this were the cost estimates that I derived for the Lot P Ethan Way, which did include those types of assumptions. They may have to be adjusted as SHRA determines the population and some of the specifics of this site that but I presume that is the goal.
And on the sites, the mayor said from up here several months ago that he would like for us as council members to identify a site in each of our districts that would house 100 people at a shelter or 100 people in the scattered sites. For the sprung shelters, the 100 people shelter, what criteria did we establish for a suitable shelter site? I know a hard stand. It's unclear to me the acreage that's needed. It's also, I know it has to have electricity, has to have sewer and water. I know those criteria. Were there any other criteria established, like not near schools, not near parks, not near libraries, not near community centers?
Excuse me, Nick, can't shout out, Nikki.
So
Again, and I'm going to ask you to leave. You're not going to be the one person that comes in here and disrupts the meeting. Thank you. Now, go ahead, Councilman Carr.
She's going to answer.
when we first started looking for sites, you are correct that the priorities were the acreage we set out sort of soft was at least an acre. Prioritizing things that were paved and had access to utilities, and then prioritizing things that were publicly owned. We thought that it would be easier to access publicly owned versus trying to negotiate with private landowner. In terms of location to other neighboring amenities, we didn't rule anything out. We always noted it. The things we did look for on the positive side were access to transit, but it wasn't a firm yes or no. But we did look at what types of services are available for the guests, and then what are the neighboring impacts. But there was no hard rule that if within X number of feet of something, then we would necessarily exclude it. That would be a part of the conversation with the community.
In our conversations with the community, what we've seen is that certain types of shelters are acceptable to people and certain aren't. The no barrier shelter raises a lot of ire. If you say you want a shelter for women and children or families or kids who are coming out of the foster system, it produces one reaction. If you say a no barrier shelter, it creates another reaction in people's minds. Now, I know we have a continuum of people. If we could segment those communities and get shelters in places where no barrier shelters we would have a hard time putting them, I think we'd have an easier time with the public. The third question concerns capacity. A number of things have been, I hear SHRA's name mentioned a couple of times. Do we have the capacity at SHRA to implement all the things that we hear are being tasked on SHRA?
So within this proposal, SHRA is really working on the Capitol Park Motel. So the scattered site and some of the other things that Emily is mentioning really still stays with the city. But the oversight for Capitol Park and the operator that's going to be working there, we will be responsible for that. And yes, we do have the capacity. And the reason that we have the capacity is really because the recommendation here is to give us the resources that we need. In terms of the financial resources. Our resources are very much constricted. They're federal sources, but with the amount of money that the city is putting forward, we will have enough resources to do this project.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. And I want to thank you, Councilmember Jennings, and Councilmember Chenier. The three of you have been working together on seeking to locate a suitable site in South Sacramento, and I know you're all working very hard on that, and good news will be forthcoming very soon. Thank you. Councilmember Chenier.
That's all right. Thank you, Mayor. Emily, I'm saving most of my comments till later, but I wanted to talk very briefly. It's actually about this slide. If you look at the Tier 2 projects, there are pluses and minuses to doing all of those kind of logistically or physically as we talk about it. And also, the timeline. I know we have a lot of folks here around the Alhambra Broadway WX corridor site, whatever we're going to call it. But I think it's important that people know what the barriers are to us getting it done and how long it will take. And also just my understanding is if these are potential HEAP-funded sites, we have to wait at minimum at least until the state budget gets passed, which is in June, and then how long it would take to prep the site and do those things. So, and actually, I think if you could run down like what it would take for the scattered site shelter, and also the 24/7 one, as far as what it would take to get those up and running.
Sure, let me take a stab at it. So starting at the top, the South Area Rehousing Shelter is prioritized as number one for a couple of reasons. First, because it gets us to a geography of the city that we think there's a great need for, and we wouldn't have, this is presuming already we've done Ethan Way and we've done Capitol Park Motel. Also, the locations that are being considered in the South area currently all are very development ready. They are paved, they have utilities, there aren't going to be very extensive issues with the owner. And so we believe that as soon as we get the funds, we could start standing up the program there, and the construction would be about 6 months. The Alhambra Broadway X Street shelter is similarly a very good opportunity, but has some more site challenges. So because it's not paved, the development of it will probably take at least an additional 4 to 6 months in addition to the construction. So even if we had the funds in hand today and access to the site, which is currently owned by Caltrans, we'd be looking at a year out before guests were likely there.
So if I can just go back, and I know a lot of our folks from St. Hope are here. Thank you for filling our inboxes, by the way. We appreciate that. So minimum time on this site would be, we're in April, May, June, so probably 14 months out.
Once we have funding and
Well, I'm talking about like from today through the state budget.
Well, and so on the state budget, and the mayor might have more information on this, the draft does have what I'm calling HEAP 2. I think they've renamed it something else. And my expectation is that the timeline would be similar to HEAP 1, where the state government would put out the application sometime in early fall. We'd submit an application. Money started flowing in HEAP 1 really quickly in state world, but it wasn't until January. So I'm sort of estimating that we might have HEAP 2 funds late winter, early, maybe you think.
Can I add to this one
Please?
a little bit?
You probably know more than I do.
So we're working as we speak with the administration and the legislature under the guise of the big city mayors, because the May revision is next month. And I'm very hopeful, although the one variable through all of it is the April tax revenues, which always define the scope of the state May revision. They will pass a budget on time, as they always do now, not in my era because of the 2/3 vote, but now it's a majority vote budget, and they pass the budgets on time. And I would expect similar timeline to what Emily just described to get the HEAP money out. But I would immediately go to our city manager and our city treasurer again and say, if this is money on the barrel here, in other words, it's going to be hopefully be formulaic, where the city will know the amount of money that we're going to get, then we can figure out the financing, if you will, to get going sooner rather than later.
So if I can pick up on that.
Yeah.
So best case scenario, assuming that there's money in the budget, assuming that the city can front the dollars until the budget dollars actually come through to us, we're probably 12 to 14 months out. Is that a reasonable estimate?
I think so.
Okay.
And then the last you asked about scattered site. So the beauty about scattered site is that theoretically they can be stood up very quickly. It's just dependent on funding and access to rental units. In talking to the operator who does this in the county, they stood up 15 homes scattered throughout the county in, I think, about 9 to 12 months. I think they were able to basically open one a month. And we have specifically suggested targeting more challenging in terms of the real estate market communities, so it might be a little bit longer. But the beauty of that is that you can scale it up as funds become available. So if those funds were available, or the $1 million on the tier 1 or the $1.5 million in tier 2, we could theoretically have some of those units open in the next couple of months. The 24/7 safe interim shelter, this is something that is primarily on tier 2 because it's sort of adjunct to triage sheltering programs, where it would have very few services. It would be sort of a springboard into something more robust, allow people who are on the streets and in a moment of crisis have a safe place to go, more akin to a warming center. The biggest challenge with that is there is no location, and this isn't something we would likely build, so we'd need to work with the community to identify an empty building or some property. The funding here only reflects the operational cost. If we were to also try to build this, you'd see additional construction costs. So this is, I think it could be a really nice component, but I think that the lead time to get to a location in a building is probably substantial.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask questions in 3 categories, and I'll make it efficient here and try to get through quickly around costs, around volume and numbers, and around operations. And I want to begin with the costs, and I want to reiterate at least my philosophy here in terms of how we are approaching this. I recognize, and we're going to see this Wednesday when the manager puts out his budget, and we're going to see it over the weeks ahead, that there is not ongoing general fund money necessarily to continue this and after 2 years. And people have talked about a cliff, and I get it. Eyes wide open. Eyes wide open. But if we don't start, and if we don't prove success, which I believe we will, then people remain on the streets, the problem gets worse, not better, and we've got no ability to go after the array of other funding sources that are available out there to continue this. And so the council appropriated $15.7 million of one-time money. And I recognize the limitation, if you will, of that dollar, which is why I'm kind of a squirrel gathering nuts here, because I look at every penny of these budgets now and ask, how far can we stretch these dollars? And so I look, for example, and I'm going to ask questions of both the city and SHRA separately for the different projects here. And I've had intensive conversations with the city management staff on this, but for example, on the Ethan Way project, you've got $1.4 million in soft costs and contingency. Soft costs and contingency. Now, I know, I'm not naive, that it takes overhead to do these things. But that number is too high for me, especially whenever every $100,000 can house more people, dozen or more people. And so I want to ask the management this question. How much money do our ratepayers, not our taxpayers, do our ratepayers spend every year to clean up the impacts of unaddressed homelessness? You don't have to answer it right now. But I know, because I've been part of these budgets, whether it's the street teams, the public works mitigation, the hosing down of sidewalks, you name it. It's millions of dollars. Why can't these contingencies and soft costs be shifted from this budget to the rate budget, the utility budget? Why not, Madam City Attorney? This is something that I know I've asked informally, and I would like this to be looked at. Because you take $1.3 million out of this budget here, as we've done rather casually, as we sit around here, those are hundreds of people that don't get shelter and potential longer-term housing because they never got the triage wraparound in the first place. The hard cost of $2.45 million. I understand that that's a comparable cost in San Diego and other places. I still don't understand, especially as we expand this, and I know I'm not an engineer and don't do construction, but why it is we cannot solicit the help of our local building trades, our building industry association, our other construction professionals, and get out there for 5 straight weekends during the spring and summer and lay foundation or something. And our young people who are looking to do something to help the homeless. Why? Why can't this budget be shaved? And you cannot tell me that's just the way that it is. Okay. I look at the SHRA project, and again, I'm very appreciative because you're entering now into a space that I know is new, relatively new to you. You deal with homeless and permanent supportive housing, but this whole issue of triage. But I look at the overall cost, the operational cost for 18 months, $10 million. We know at Railroad Avenue that, yeah, fewer beds and a different kind of an operation, and we know this is a new operation where we don't know a lot in terms of how you're going to do this with rooms as opposed to sprung shelters, that the costs may be variable. But I really want to work with you guys to help us bring down this cost here. And how much we just have to. And again, it's not, I'm not looking to put it into anything else, but to maybe give it right back to you to help us with the next one. Because $10 million for 18 months it's too much money. And we need it because we don't have ongoing general fund money to try to get thousands of people off the streets. So that's some highlights, if you will, of the precious dollars and how we can save as many as possible. On the numbers issue, and this is one that we have with the community all along, I want to acknowledge that there are 2 ways to go about this, and one is not better than the other, it's just different. One is to really pilot to perfection or near perfection, and the other is to build the scale even if it's not going to be perfect. And we're obviously opting for the latter because of the condition on our streets. The goal, again, is 800 beds. 831, I think, was actually the number, but 800 beds. And Councilmember Carr, you're right. The goal is to get people out an average of every 4 months. Now, that doesn't mean the person who's been on the streets for years, who's sick, is going to get out into permanent housing in 4 months. But somebody may get out and will get out in 2 weeks because they've reunited with family. And then you average that, right? And there's going to be a set of averages. But we got to create the throughput. And one of the great things about this Capitol Park project, by the way, is that it does operate as a twofer. Some of the people who go through the triage may be the very people that get the permanent housing when it is converted to permanent housing. And so we are focused on each individual as a person, but we're also focused on volume. And that's why we have to that's why we're asking that these shelters be built all over the city. Because it's not enough to just build 200 beds in one place and say, well, don't we feel good? Didn't we do a lot of good? Because there's still thousands of people who are sleeping out on the streets. And they're your neighbors and my neighbors and our residents of this city. Third thing, the operational questions with regard to the Capitol Park shelter. And again, not necessarily be answered now, but to be thought through. This notion of low barrier triage is very, very important because it does aim for the people who are the sickest, really, and the most in need. On the other hand, Councilmember Carr, I think, over time has made a pretty compelling point, and others have as well. Man, if you could get half the people off the street, even if they weren't the hardest to serve, why wouldn't that be a good thing? So I think we have to kind of assess that balance here, right? And it begs the question, pets were appropriate in a sprung shelter. Are pets appropriate in a hotel-like setting? If the answer is no, we have to recognize a consequence to that, in that it'll be less low barrier than we want. Again, what type of population are we contemplating serving? Steve and Jeff have asked these questions as well. How are we going to work to recruit a qualified operator? And for SHRA that hasn't done this before, given that Emily and her team have a full workload, because we're asking them to expand into the South and elsewhere, how are you going to pull this off with fidelity to the philosophy that we want to see here, right? This is not permanent supportive housing in its first stage. Intensive case management, intensive services, and trying to actually, something that you're not used to doing, to actually purposefully try to move people out as quickly as possible when they are ready to move out. And then, what are we going to do together to make sure that we are constantly evaluating what we're doing, both qualitatively and quantitatively, so that the public knows the imperfections, but also knows the positive results in terms of people who were on the streets for how long, who are now off the streets, and why their lives are better. So those are my questions and initial thoughts. I think we should turn it over, Councilmember Warren, if you're willing to wait until after the public testimony. Let's turn it over to the public now, and then we'll turn it back to the City Council for more discussion and a vote.
Thank you. I have 16 speakers signed up to speak. This, sorry, already been a long day. This meeting is.
Speakers, trying to say.
Sorry. This meeting.
We could take that personally, by the way.
I'm sorry. This meeting is video streamed and can be viewed later or live from the city's website. Members of the public who wish to address the council should complete a speaker slip, which can be found at the back of the room. Speaker slips do need to be turned into the clerk prior to the beginning of each item, and this item has begun. Please fully complete the speaker slip with name and any phonetic clarification and preferred pronoun so that everyone has the opportunity to address the council. Members of the public are asked to observe the rules of decorum. The council rules of procedure outline decorum expected in the chambers and can be found on our website. A copy is in the back of the room and is summarized on the back of the speaker slip. For instance, use of swear words, yelling from the audience, physically threatening conduct, and displays of disrespect are discouraged. The presiding officer will request that a person cease disruptive conduct, and if not immediately stopped, the presiding officer will direct the person to leave the council meeting. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to address the council. Please silence cell phones or other communication devices, and a cordless microphone, assisted listening device, and parking validations are available from the clerk. My first speaker is Bob Erlenbush, followed by Mike Jaskey, Howard Lawrence, and then Jamison Parker.
Good afternoon, Mayor and City Council people. Thank you for including Emily in the staff report, our homeless desk report, and thank you, Councilmember Hanson, for referring to it. We think, the coalition thinks, that all these programs address the very issues that you mentioned in your remarks, Councilmember Hanson, that these shelters and programs are harm reduction and life-saving. The coalition fully supports Capitol Park Hotel, Broadway and X, South Sacramento, and any other program that we haven't heard about. And I would like to address the audience who oppose any or all of these emergency solutions with a couple of facts. Did you know, as you mentioned, one homeless person dies every 6 days for the last 17 years in our community? 80% of the homeless are our neighbors, as you said, Mayor. They're our neighbors. 80% were born and raised in Sacramento. 30% of the 900 homeless people who have died over the last 17 years have died very violent deaths. Murders, stabbings, shootings, hangings, strangulation. If we don't do something, is anybody who's opposed to these programs in the audience going to relegate homeless people to those kinds of deaths? The average age of a homeless death in our community is only 50 years old, and for the young women and women in the audience, the average age for women is only 45. 40% of the homeless in our community are African American, 4 times the number of black people in the house community. The homeless look like the first 4 rows of this audience that 1,000 unaccompanied youth are homeless in Sacramento every day.
Thank you for your comments. Your time is complete.
My last comment is that we know that the low barrier works.
Thank you for your comments.
It is a best practice, and I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
My next speaker is Mike Jaskey, then Howard Lawrence.
Mayor Steinberg, members of the City Council, for the record, my name is Mike Jaskey, representing Sacramento area congregations together. And thank you, Mayor, for your vision and your passion. Appreciate it. SACAC generally supports the proposed homeless services funding plan prepared by staff and under your approval today. We believe it makes sense to move forward with those projects that are concrete and with the funds available. We have two suggestions for amendments to the proposed plan. First, Capitol Park Hotel obviously is changing from an SRO format to a PSH eventually and a shelter in between. It's going to displace existing residents. SRHA has indicated that they will take care of all of these current residents and assure that they're housed. We ask that you direct them to provide a report to you about the status of these persons every 6 months and how much money extra it's costing to house them in some other alternative location. We need to make sure that no one ends up on the street. Second, we urge you to amend the staff's proposed priority for the other projects for which money is not yet available to include the tiny home project proposed by First Steps Community. It's much cheaper than the sprung shelters that are under discussion here today. It may even provide superior services because of the privacy allowed and the kind of community sense that may exist in that kind of setting. This should be a high priority in this next set of projects.
Emily, can you please, Ms. Halkin, can you please respond to that, the tiny home question? I know we've been through it before, but it's specifically the project that Mr. Jeski's talking about.
So I think he's talking about the First Step Community sort of transitional program that is a tiny home that's off the grid. That's the one you're talking about, Steve's, right? So as I understand it, that program was designed really to be more transitional, so this is a proposal for sheltering. That being said, there's nothing to preclude a different physical environment if we decided that tiny homes were a more appropriate physical environment than a sprung structure. The reason that we went for the sprung structures is not only because they're cost efficient, but because while they can act like a permanent structure, they also have temporary qualities about them, so that when we close a location, we could literally pick up the structure and move it to the next one. And so that was really appealing to our public works facilities folks in terms of both getting them up quickly and getting them down quickly as well.
So should it be on our list or not?
Mayor, can I say
Go
something
ahead,
real
Jim.
quickly?
Yep.
I actually met with Mr. Waters this morning, and what we'd like to do is, as we look at the Broadway site over time, use that as an option for that site. So I think we can do two things at once here.
Here we go.
That would be great.
Thank you.
In play. Thank you. Good.
Howard Lawrence and then Jamison Parker.
Good afternoon, Mayor Steinberg, Mayor of the City Council. My name is Howard Lawrence, and I am also a representative of Sacramento Area Congregations Together, which, as you know, is a faith-based community organizing network here in Sacramento. And we've been dedicated to helping create a more just Sacramento. Today, I want to speak more from the faith perspective rather than any specific policy. Sacramento Act supports the triage shelter proposals being advocated by the mayor and several council members because of our faith values. Helping end the hardship for those who are forced to sleep without shelter is the right thing to do, and strongly supported by our ACT members, and I believe the community at large. I would like to share a story with you. Last week, prior to the press conference regarding the Capitol Park Hotel, I was having a cup of coffee at a local establishment nearby. The server asked me if I was doing anything special, and I replied that I was attending a press conference to express our support for the conversion of the Capitol Park Hotel into a triage shelter. Her response was, "Good. We need to do something to help those people." I believe that worker is reflective of the larger community. We need to do something to help end the suffering endured by those who experience homelessness. We know that you on the council hear from the NIMBY folks at community meetings and in your emails, but I am convinced the large majority of Sacramentans want you to do the right thing and do something to help those people. Sacramento Act pledges to give you that support and encourage each and every member of the City Council to do your fair share regarding triage shelters and to let your values inform your decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Next speaker is Jamison Parker, then Michael Alt, then Katie Jung.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. I'm Jamison Parker with the Midtown Association. We're a property business improvement district spanning from 16th Street all the way to Alhambra Boulevard. We're here to say we're supportive of this idea of moving from the declaration around the emergency shelter crisis to implementing shelters. We understand that's an important component of what the city needs to do to start to address the homeless-related issue. We sound like a broken record, but we have to continue to also say that homelessness is probably the #1 issue that we face in our district. On a year-to-year basis, we see about a 30% increase of calls for service related to homelessness. In the last quarter of 2018 to the first quarter of 2019, we had a 40% of increase in homeless-related calls. And I understand that the X Street conversation isn't a priority of today's discussion. We've been encouraged with the conversations with Councilmember Chenier and Hansen on that site. We do have a couple specific requests as it relates to that site as it does get discussed. One, since we've been servicing the Alhambra corridor, the freeway underpasses for the last almost 2.5 years, we have a navigator that obviously knows the population really well in that area. We've been working with Councilmember Chenier and hope that we have the ability to have a direct referral ability for that shelter site location. The second thing is that site is at the immediate exit of one of our major freeways and a kind of a nexus and connection point into our central city. We ask that the fencing that's being considered along that side of the exit have some type of art application that really creates some vibrancy and as well as adds the privacy of that site as well. The last thing is that as you start to look at your fiscal year budget of 1920, we ask that you look at other public amenities for investments. Specifically, we'd like to see some Wind Park investments
Your
around
comments,
$600,000.
your time is complete.
Thank you,
James. Thank you.
Michael Alt, then Katie Young.
Mayor, City Manager, members of council, Michael Alt with the Downtown Partnership. I think as you've heard us communicate in the past, we know that you are continuing to work on solutions to move people out of homelessness. And I think you've had a partner and will continue to have a partner with us downtown. We have continued to communicate the importance of the Housing First solution, and we will work with not only your staff and do want to acknowledge the support Emily has given us in the communication, especially with the PBID Coalition, but we'll also work with Lachelle and Christine as we really work to mitigate some of the impacts on this facility. We know this facility is important. We do think that a comprehensive good neighbor policy is going to be important to managing this facility and making sure that we allocate the appropriate funds commensurate with what we've seen in the railroad facility. Managing these facilities is as important for the individuals as it is for the public. The downtown location does pose a little bit of a unique challenge. We've got over 3 million people a year that walk by the front of that building. We're going to make sure that we need to do a couple of things on a good neighbor policy effort, that we work on a septet analysis to make sure the environment around it is managed effectively, work on trying to find resources to make sure that we prevent the shelter residents from being preyed upon by criminal elements. We've also got some health impacts on pedestrians from shelter residents, smoking and other issues, and we want to make sure to address that. We think a fully serviced restroom on the ground floor would be important for the individuals, but also potentially for the public that could be staffed, and we'd like to work with you on that, and also potentially a stakeholder task force that could manage the effort and provide feedback to the city and SHRA with how the facility is being managed. I think as Jamison said and Councilmember Hansen, we would like to have some direct ability for us to give referral priority to some of the existing assisting downtown individuals, specifically the chronic homelessness. We know the people, we work with them.
Thank you for
You
your
have a
comments.
partner,
Your
and
time
we will
is
work with you.
complete.
All good suggestions. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Katie Young, then Brady King, then Carrie Wehrle.
Good afternoon, Mayor Steinberg and council members. My name is Katie Jung, and I am the Student Service Coordinator at both PS7 Middle School and the 9th Grade Academy at Sac High. I currently serve in a role that oversees the holistic health and development of our students, and I have immense concerns about the exposure and safety our students may face when walking to and from school if the Alhambra location was to proceed. We have about 9 schools and after-school programs that serve 2,500 students from preschool to 12th grade, and it profoundly confuses me that we could possibly propose a low-barrier shelter so close to these locations. With parents often working late and unable to pick up their students immediately after school, many of our students will walk through the alleyways and sidewalks that surround the proposed facility to oftentimes the stores surrounding the area. Additionally, with PS7 offering longer school days to provide extra support to our students, we often have students catching the bus when it's dark and late at night. Again, these are not always high school students, these are often little kids. I want to believe that the heart and intentions behind this shelter and rehousing strategy is one of social justice, safety, and compassion for those who are marginalized. However, if you place this shelter in such close proximity to our children and youth, I cannot believe that this initiative is for justice and safety for all. Last week, when the council approved the ban of flavored tobacco, Councilmember Gira, in a KCRA interview, said, "At the end of the day, if we have to choose between adults and kids, we are going to support our kids. I hope that you will support our kids and vote no on the proposal before you." Thank you.
Ms. Jung, I want to ask you a question. You said that the kids at the school are engaged in various after-school programs. Do any of them involve volunteering or working with the homeless population in any part of Sacramento?
I know that some of our kids actually do volunteer at the Sacramento Food Bank and the clothing place around there.
Vulnerable people there too, right?
Yeah,
And the food bank's pretty close to school, right?
yeah, that's very true. Mhm.
Okay. And are there any circumstances in terms of safety requirements, mitigation, resources that would make you feel any differently about the potential of housing some of our unsheltered people in the location that Councilmember Chenier is talking about? Are there any circumstances?
My biggest concern is the fact that there is a low barrier acceptance. Go
That
ahead.
hasn't been decided exactly yet,
Okay,
okay?
yeah. When I read the report, I did see that it said low barrier for the Alhambra location. I could be mistaken.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I want to make a suggestion to you. You can remain in opposition, that's absolutely your right, and I respect it. But I would suggest that you actually become part of whatever working group that Councilmember Chenier puts together as this moves forward to make sure that every one of your concerns is addressed. In other words, you can oppose it, always oppose it if that's what you believe. But I would suggest you do so from the inside and actually help to make it better. I think that would be a very constructive and important approach to take here. Because we are going to locate these triage shelters in a lot of places in the city that people don't want. And there are schools and there are kids everywhere. And we're going to always try to be sensitive to our neighborhoods and our neighborhood concerns. But I'm sorry, this is every bit as an important a mission to this city as what the Great St. Hope mission represents. It's opportunity for people who are disenfranchised, marginalized, and left out. I respect your point of view. I just ask you to get to the table with Councilmember Chenier and get to work to see if you can try to make this acceptable to you over the course of time.
Definitely.
Thank you
For your suggestions.
Thank you
Mayor.
so much. Appreciate it.
Next speaker is Brady King, then Carrie Wehrle, then Julian Love.
Hi, my name is Brady King, and I'm currently Dean of Students at Sacramento High School. But not only that, I grew up in Oak Park. My family grew up in Oak Park. They've been there for over 60 years now. I've also been a parent of a PS7 and a Sac High student, and I'm concerned. Our teachers, our staff, our parents and students have kind of been left out of this process for the proposed Oak Park homeless triage site. I know that there was a meeting held, which included students and teachers from Burbank High School to discuss the Florence site, and I'm just trying to understand why the community in Oak Park wasn't given that same opportunity. We work hard as a staff every day to ensure our students are safe. We already have families concerned about some of the problems that the neighborhood presents itself, and this just kind of adds to that. The proposed facility actually sits right just a few feet away from the preschool at the Salvation Army and shares a fence with College Track and Teach for America, where hundreds of our students go every single day after school to receive support. Just yesterday, in fact, the police were called because a homeless resident came into the building and exposed himself. Last week, when it was announced that Florence facility would not move forward, one of the Luther Burbank teachers was quoted in the SACB stating that they do need to be able to enforce the anti-camping ordinance, so they need open beds, but the population involved is too high risk to be near kids. And Councilmember Chenier, you were referenced in that same article stating, I think the new site is much further away from the population centers. Well, that site in Oak Park is actually closer to students than that site, and our students take that bus that sits right there next to that facility every single day. A facility that's not going to screen for sex offenders or check for criminal backgrounds. So I'm just asking that you vote no, or at a minimum kind of push this out so that our families in Oak Park can have the same chance to speak as those at Burbank did.
Thank you for your comments. Your time is complete.
Councilman Chenier.
If I may, I just want to correct a couple of things, because I want to be clear about this. It's important. The first call, when we identified this potential site, the first call I made was to Jake. The very first call, and we talked about it. We did have one community meeting. We had about 180 people there. I'll get to that later as well. We had an advisory board committee meeting or advisory committee meeting that at least 3 members, I believe, of St. Hope attended. I've committed from day one that I would be happy to sit down with the principals and teachers and parents and meet whenever. We have, as Emily has said, we're a year out on this thing. There's plenty of time for discussion, and I'm happy to do that. I made that commitment early on, and I'll reinforce it right here. So I just think it's, when you say we're not allowing you the same as we did Florence, that's just not true.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Carrie Wehrle, then Julian Love, then Jake Mossevier.
Hello, my name is Carrie Wehrle, and I am the Chief of Schools at St. Hope Public Schools, where I manage the school leaders at Sac High, PS7, and Oak Park Prep, and am responsible for 1,500 students. We are in the middle of testing season, and because this meeting is being held at 2 p.m. while school is in session, it has made it nearly impossible for our teachers, students, and parents to attend. So I am here today with a small representation of my team, and then we'll need to get right back to school, but this item was incredibly important to us because it impacts student safety. I have participated in the Way Up Education Collaborative along with the principals from all of the schools in Oak Park for the past several years. We meet once a quarter to discuss issues and opportunities affecting students in the community. I attended our last meeting 2 weeks ago, and the Oak Park Homeless Triage Facility was not on the agenda. I also attended Way Up's Oak Park Smart 2 Saturdays ago, along with the school leaders and nonprofits in Oak Park, and again, nothing was said. I want to understand why we were not engaged before this point. I understand what you're saying about it's forthcoming, but if the decision is being made, then we were not a voice that was brought to the table before the location was finalized. This facility would have a major impact on our community, and as school leaders, we're ultimately responsible for the safety and well-being of our students, so we're here advocating for them. Our voices are important, and last week, every school leader that we talked to in the area was unaware that this facility was coming and had expressed some major concerns. We also have to answer to our families, and every parent I spoke with this week was also unaware of the facility. They wanted to know why they haven't been engaged yet. I am here to ask that this vote be delayed until our school leaders, our parents, our teachers, and our scholars in Oak Park are given the opportunity to have their voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Julian Love, then Jake Mossevier, then Bob Dutra.
Hello, my name is Julian Love. I'm an Oak Park resident and member of the Oak Park Business Association. I'd like to start by acknowledging the mayor and the council for taking care of our homeless population and taking that action. They're a voiceless and vulnerable population, and I appreciate that. But we here are today to represent a vulnerable and voiceless population, and that's our young people. I was made aware, as Brady King stated earlier, that there was a site proposed for the Florin Road Light Rail District, or the Florin Road Light Rail location. Appropriately, Burbank students, staff, and families were engaged. They met and they decided that wasn't the right location for them based on the proximity to the school and their students going to and from that location every day. And I think the process was right in that case. The problem is the Oak Park community did not get that same opportunity. We hear that it's going to happen now that the site has been identified, and we want to put it here, and it's going to happen going forward. But the problem was, as Carrie mentioned, it didn't happen beforehand. I'm also aware there was a community meeting at the Sierra 2 Center in Curtis Park with majority Curtis Park residents. But if you spent any time in these neighborhoods, you know that that location is really in Oak Park and is going to impact the Oak Park community, including nearly 2,200 students within a half-mile radius. Among those, a lot of those, the youngest and most vulnerable students are preschool students. And so we're here today, and I'm here today just to ask that before we move forward, let's really delay the vote until Oak Park community and organizations are legitimately engaged and their voices are heard. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Jake Massaweir, then Bob Dutra, then Greg Wilson.
Hello, my name is Jake Massaweir. I'm the CEO of St. Hope, and I'm an Oak Park resident. The plight of our homeless population is in no question. We know that there truly is a crisis in Sacramento and that our homeless need all the care that they can get. But I'm here today to talk about two major issues. One is the process, and the second is proximity. From a process standpoint, there has not been engagement in the Oak Park community. There was a meeting held at Sierra 2, which was full of Curtis Park residents, to talk about a facility that would be proposed in Oak Park. If you really want the engagement from the community, you actually have to engage them. So to answer your question, Mr. Mayor, about what would you do, I think there's a lot of good ideas, but the community actually has to be talked to. Second is proximity. How can we propose this so close to schools, a shelter that does not screen for sex offenders? I brought this up to Mr. Chenier's office because I did go to a meeting which you were not able to attend, and they said they were aware of this. In fact, you can't build a school there. It's against California Penal Code. However, they told me that they had found a loophole in the law, which is incredibly concerning because what that says is that they're actively searching for a way to circumvent the standard, which is there to protect students in order to build this facility. But in closing, I'll say this. Today in Sacramento, our communities of color are starved for real investments, new and expanded business opportunities, new jobs, and not just social services. Racially restrictive covenants barred non-whites from neighborhoods like Curtis Park and East Sacramento. Instead, they went to places like Oak Park, which didn't have such restrictions. If we do not insist on equity, if we don't put real resources where our beliefs and our values lie, then we will relegate more generations of people to lesser lives than they deserve. I believe in those words, but those aren't my words. Those came from the mayor's State of the City speech this year. If we are committed to equity,
Familiar to me.
if we're committed to equity, has Oak Park not taken on its fair share of social services compared to Oak Park or Curtis Park in East Sacramento? There's a big difference, and there's a thin line between Oak Park stepping up and Oak Park getting stepped on. And I ask that this council delay the vote until Oak Park can truly be engaged in this conversation.
Next speaker is Bob Dutra, then Greg Wilson, then Carly Brannon.
My name is Bob Dutra. I own Bob's Glass Company. First, I'd just like to say I'm very nervous. I'm not political. This is all unbelievably new to me. I will be out of here as quickly as I can. I'm opposed to the placement of any shelter in anyone's neighborhood and by anyone's business. This proposed shelter on Broadway or on Alhambra is right next to my business. This has been going on for several years now. I've heard all the rosy stuff, but I haven't heard none of the realities that I've had to put up with. I've had an employee stabbed, I've been threatened, and nothing from no one. I went to the meeting the other day, and it was like it didn't matter. None of this matters. I've heard about the percentages of crime, and then I find out that there's two sets of crimes. taxpayers' crime and people who are asking for assistance crime. So how can anyone give any of us statistics on crime when there's two levels? What level are we dealing with? Are we dealing with the soft level, or are we dealing with the hardcore level? We're dealing with taxpayers here, and it feels like we don't matter. I mean, we're paying the bill. You guys are biting the hand that's feeding you. I mean, I'm not against homeless and taking care of them. I'm for doing it the right way. We all count. I've done my life the way I think it was supposed to have been done. And I'm experiencing, other than this situation, the fruits of that. I didn't make the wrong decisions. I never once put a needle in my arm. And then come and claim that I'm mentally ill. Of course I'm mentally ill if I'm sitting there shooting drugs all the time with no controls. And that's not
For
fair.
your comments, your time is complete.
Mr. Dutra, you did a good job testifying. You really did. You told your story, so you were nervous, but you did a really good job. I want to ask you one question.
Yes, sir.
Okay? How bad, you have a business that is right there, I understand. How bad is the homeless problem under the freeway, adjoining the freeway, adjoining your business without the shelter? How bad is it right now?
Unbelievably horrible. We have school kids that used to walk by our place daily. They would come in during the hotter months and catch a drink of water, whatever. I haven't seen that since this started.
It's bad.
It's very bad.
And it's affecting your business the way it is right now.
It is affecting my business.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.
Well, just one quick comment.
We give everybody 2 minutes.
I understand.
I'd be happy to
Sometimes
talk to
2
you.
minutes isn't enough.
I understand. I'd be happy to talk to you after the meeting and give you as much time as you need.
This is what happens.
Well, okay.
And next
Wanna-
speaker-
Okay, well, no.
You don't even get to say everything you need to say, but
What do you?
You're not on 2 minutes.
What do you have? No, I am not, sir.
And next speaker is Greg Wilson, Carly Brannon, then Jared Fisher.
Where do I put the thing to? Thank you, Mayor Steinberg and council members. My name is Greg Wilson, and I'm the treasurer of Ways. We're at your service, which is a small nonprofit based in Sacramento, providing shared bedroom housing in the area for homeless and those on the brink of homelessness. We reviewed the city council report for discussion item 1 and also the city's RFI for general triage shelter operations. Our comments are specific to scattered site shelters, which are addressed on page 14 of the city council report. This report states that each scattered site residential home could be launched for approximately $115,000 per year. And looking at the budget that was placed earlier, my best guess is that the funding that you have is approximately $250,000 for each house. Our comment is that we feel the estimate might be a little bit low, considering that triage shelters require 24/7 house monitor. I did a quick calculation of labor costs this morning and got to about $250,000 per year. Adding in rent, food, utilities, insurance, we estimate the annual cost more like $300,000, and that doesn't include all the kind of behavioral services, case management, housing case management, housing navigation, client transportation, animal care services, and on-site security. And so we'll be responding to the city's RFI with a more accurate estimate. And finally, we wanted to state that some of the characteristics of the low barrier triage shelters, specifically the lack of requirements to abstain from alcohol and drugs, might not be conducive to living in residential areas. So those are our comments.
Thank you, sir, for testifying.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Carly Brannon, then Jared Fisher, then Nikki Jones, and Kevin Bolts.
So I'm glad to hear that you are finally
coming up with a plan to address homelessness. It's been a long time, but it's still not good enough. I think that a lot of these community members out here have some valid concerns. I also think that, I don't know, they have valid concerns. So adding this up, it looks like it's 332 beds when there's like thousands of people who sleep outside. You need to do more. You mentioned the railroad location, and there's quite a few problems with that. People have to be referred by the police to get in there, so that opens people up to criminalization, people who live outside specifically. Oftentimes, police drive unhoused people out there and drop them off, even after confirming that there are no beds available. I see that you're looking down again and not paying attention to the public, Daryl. The railroad location was opened up as, oh, and now you're leaving, Daryl. Bye. Okay, so there's no accountability there. What about transparency and accountability, Daryl? Anyway, so the railroad location was opened up as a 100-bed shelter was closed. It was supposed to be 200 beds, but ended up only being 100 beds, so we're still at a net gain of 0 beds. Even after this council declared a shelter crisis, which has since ended without an extension or without any new beds being added. So I don't have a lot of time left. I'm just going to say the demands. You need to include that tiny home proposal mentioned earlier. The city of Sacramento is listed as an absentee owner on 200 plus vacant parcels in title company searches. So you need to really explore those places too. I'm not sure why those are not being mentioned. You need to remove the no-sit lay clause in the city hall use ordinance.
Thank you for your comments, ma'am.
We need rent control and some things that we've been saying for years.
Thank you for your comments. We'll go ahead and call the next speaker.
My next speaker is Jared Fisher, then Nikki Jones. Thank you for your comments. Your time is complete.
Ma'am, thank you for your comments. If you continue to exceed your time, we're going to have to ask you to leave. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your time. Thank you for your time. We're going to go ahead and call the next speaker. Yes, we do know that. Thank you. Could you, if the clerk could please call the next speaker.
Speaker is Jared Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Hello. Obviously, this is very complicated, but I'm here to specifically ask that all these efforts, that they specifically promote any and all efforts to keep our unhoused neighbors in their specific communities. I've been to a lot of meetings where it's been a lot of talk of busing people out and shipping people off to other areas or just other parts of the city. And that's specifically what I want to speak to. I live 4 blocks from the proposed Alhambra site, right down the street from the food bank in Oak Park, with my wife and 3 young children. And we've gotten to know our unhoused neighbors over the years. They often check in on us. And they have told us, as we have seen, that they have just as much pride in their neighborhood and as much connection to where they live, even though they do not have a roof, as we do. Having community is a vital need, just like food and shelter. I've seen again and again situations where somebody needing shelter, and I've been a part of this. I've driven people to the bus station and the train station to see them off to another place where there is a distant relative or a somewhat higher likelihood of getting help in San Francisco or other places. And they come back here to their home base where there may not be a roof for them, but there is familiarity, there is friendship, and there is none of that soul-crushing loneliness that comes from being in need and being in a place where no one knows you and a place where nobody needs you. I volunteer at Wellspring Women's Center 2 blocks away, and have seen the number of unhoused and housing insecure women and their young children swell in our neighborhood. All of these people are just trying hard to get by in their immediate neighborhood in which they identify, and they are not all or even mostly people with severe psychological disorders or drug habits posing dangers to the community. They are largely people in crisis, a lot of whom are women, again, with small or non-existent safety nets that people who look like me have always had. The overwhelming majority of the unhoused people I talked to, including 2 days ago for a couple hours, have told me they just want stability, they want safety for their loved ones if they are lucky enough to not be separated from the people they love because of living on the streets, and they just want to be treated with the bare minimum of humanity that most of the people in this room are afforded every single day. I would just urge that everybody here, especially you on the council, to continue to strongly consider the expert testimony given again and again by social workers and the other professionals who work hand in hand with our unhoused neighbors every day, seeing and learning what works best and what doesn't, and who know that the solution of wishing away or sending away people is not moral.
Thank you for your comments today.
The next speaker is Nikki Jones, and then Kevin Boltz is our final speaker.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon. It is nice to see like a more comprehensive plan on the table. It's sad to see kind of the continued top-down, short-sighted, not cost-effective strategies, kind of a one-size-fits-all. I know once Emily said the diversity of housing stock is just as important as the quantity. And I really believe that's important. That's why when we talk about tiny shelters, we talk about leaving people where they are, right? That is actually a diversity of shelter tactic. Because when folks, when we see how many beds we even potentially have, how many years down the road, right? We're still looking at so many months and so many years for these people who are experiencing crisis now. And they're strategizing ways to survive every day. We need to be empowering those strategies. We need drinking fountains, we need bathrooms, we need the ability to shelter in place. Because even with those many years and those hundreds of beds, we still have thousands of people living outside and thousands of more people on their way to that. And we don't have a robust preventative system yet. We want to build one, of course we do. We don't have it. And what's not a robust preventative system is putting 90 vulnerable residents out on the street so you can put in a shelter. The Capitol Park project is not a good solution. The Capitol Park project is a tool that follows in the legacies of historical racism, the removal of SROs, which is another diverse housing option that meets vulnerable people's needs. So when we don't have those, when we have less and less of those, we're meeting less and less vulnerable people's needs. And so we know that it's in the big business interest for decades. Steve, you are not transparent. It is in their interest to turn that SRO into anything else and to have less and less SROs within the form of their district. And that's you serving them. That's not you serving the vulnerable population that lives in your district. I want to see bathrooms, I want to see water fountains, and I want to see people sheltering in place.
Thank you for your comments.
Our final speaker is Kevin Boltz.
And I'm hungry too.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. Kevin Boltz, District 5. I wanted to juxtapose this love fest that happened earlier with the knowledge that this council voted to remove all the human beings that used to live outside this building on February 27th. I'd also like to cite a January 25th article in the Bee, which is titled, "Hours After Mayor's Apology, Police Remove Homeless from City Hall in a Rainstorm." I want to talk about causation. I moved here in August of 2015, paying in a two-bedroom apartment, paying $9.25 a month in Steve's district. A year later, I was paying $10.25 a month. An article from October 2016 in the Bee is titled, "They Stopped Building Apartments, Now Sac Area Rents Have Spiked." That was the year you got elected. It's nothing new. By October of 2018, last year when I moved out, my rent offered was $12.75, a $350 increase in 3 years with no upgrades made. A study in Seattle shows us that for every $100 increase in rent, there's a 15% increase in homelessness. 15. Simple math puts my numbers at 52%. An ABC 10 article from March 4th, that's the day you arrested and brutalized 84 protesters, said that homelessness has increased 30% and the unsheltered population has increased 85%. So my 52 sits right in the middle. Another cause of violence against this community is the anti-camping ordinance. It allows your police officers to steal, harass, and ultimately lead to death homeless people on the streets by stealing their camping belongings and survival gear. You refuse to vote on this like you did a flavor ban a week ago, so you obviously know how to do this, you just don't want to. And that's the problem. You don't want to. So I'm gonna talk to you real quick. You don't listen to empathy, you don't listen to words, you don't listen to tears, mothers grieving, you don't really listen to a fucking thing. So I'm gonna talk to the one thing you do listen to, your political capital and your political future. If you don't fix this city, don't look away from me. In the way that these people want it, you will never see the end of my face again. I will pop up in any race you race in. You run for PTA, I'm gonna run for PTA. You run for Doris's congressional seat, I'm gonna run for it. You wanna be mayor again, I'm gonna run for mayor. I don't even wanna win, I just
Mr. Bolts, thank you for your time.
I will pop up your ideological left.
Mr. Bolts, thanks for your time.
For the useless centrist that you are.
I've asked you to, you've exceeded your time. Thank you, Mr. Bolts. Thank you.
I have no more.
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Eric. Okay. Let's return now back to the City Council for discussion deliberation. I think the queue got a little messed up, so I'm going to turn it over first to Councilmember Harris. And then, I don't know, Councilmember Ashby is on here, now off, so I'm not, okay. Go with Councilmember Harris.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, I've heard a lot of testimony based on assumptions, and I have to tell you, having been intimately involved with the Railroad Avenue shelter, I found the site, I helped build it, I've visited it numerous times over the last year, and worked closely with VOA. I find that people have a lot of misconceptions about what homelessness actually is. I know that people feel they have, you know, ideas and conceptions of what goes on, but I can tell you exactly what happened at the railroad shelter. And I would challenge people who are opposed to shelters, who say that this will impact my community negatively, that you are making an assumption. Your de facto assumption every time is that this will cause harm. That's not what we found at Railroad. In fact, we have a lot of data that we garnered that crime actually decreased in the neighborhood because we paid more attention to crime and we were looking to mitigate the impacts. This can be done. We can house homeless people in triage shelters, and we can move them into a more permanent, stable house situation. It requires a lot of money, it requires a lot of effort and a lot of input. The net result, however, is that people with very significant issues can be moved off the street. It's also fair to say that the people are on the street already, and when you move them into a shelter, that's a net positive. You know, and we found that in the area of Railroad. There is also a fact that there are over 3,000 chronically unhoused individuals in the Sacramento region. And if we stand up 300 beds, you may not see a huge and significant visual impact immediately, but over time, that is our goal, and that's what we need to do. Look, here's the fact. More than 50% of the people who are unhoused are mentally infirm and or addicted to drugs. It could be opioids, it could be methamphetamines. This is what we found at Railroad. When you do a low barrier triage shelter and you accept people with dogs and mates and possessions, you're going to get people who have a plethora of issues, very deep problematic issues that you have to work with if you're going to make them successful in housing. It is labor intensive and money intensive, as I said. But there are a few things that we found at Railroad, and I really want to put this out as much for my colleagues as for the constituents. A problem we found at Railroad is that people would set up a camp in proximity to the shelter. They'd come in at night, get fed, get safe for the evening, shower, and then go out to their campsite during the day and hang out, often to do drugs, and then come back into the shelter tremendously intoxicated to the point where they were not really serviceable in terms of helping them deal with issues. This is a chronic problem. The fact of the matter is that a lot of drug dealers came to the Railroad shelter almost on a daily basis and preyed upon the homeless, sold them drugs, kept them in the bondage of addiction, and we didn't really have an adequate solution for that. The shelter provider actually helped tremendously and sort of beat off the drug vendors. There are a lot of impediments to us having an enforcement component to drug abuse in shelters. Some of that's state law, and we have to work with that. And in fact, Chief Hahn and the mayor and I were speaking about this the other day, that if we're really going to deal with mental infirmity on this scale, exacerbated by drug use, we have to have a deeper toolkit. All that being said, all of these issues were happening in the area of Railroad to a more significant extent, and it wasn't the shelter that was causing the problems. But we have to pay more mind to how we manage the shelters and gather more management tools. Another big problem was compassionate giving, or what's known as street feeding. So people from faith-based groups were attracted to this shelter because there was homeless energy there, set up on the street and started doling out food and clothing. This created a lot of very negative impacts, not only in trash, but it attracted more homeless people to that area, and then people came and were car camping. We had to deal with those. We had to do parking enforcement. We have to work harder at that. It's quite possible that the Ethan Way shelter will be the next, after Capitol Park, the next sprung tent shelter triage type model of a lot of people under one roof. There are advantages to that and there are disadvantages to that. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of nuance to how you run a shelter. And if you set up so that somebody can come in, not avail themselves of services, and then feed their addiction, we'll spend an awful lot of money and not get the results we want. We won't get the throughput that we need to actually move a volume of people off the street. So, Emily, I want to give you direction, and that is this, and it ties into what Councilmember Carr has said. The mantra of low barrier for all of our shelter sites is not workable, not in my opinion, not after having had a lot of experience at Railroad. We have to be more nuanced. We can move more people off the streets if we serve some of the easier to serve at one site and have some low barrier triage, but it should not all be low barrier. The drug aspect of this is legion, and we have to manage it. Another problem is possessions. Now, it's okay if people bring a lot of possessions, but they can't bring them inside the shelter. We encountered a lot of problems with that. You know, mice and other vermin would come in with the possessions into the shelter. If we do a low barrier approach, we have to keep those possessions outside and only allow inside the shelter those necessities that people need on a daily basis. And it's also training for doing well in a house situation to not be a hoarder, because that's a barrier to entry to housing. Another one is dogs. This was a very low barrier shelter at Railroad, and we had people come in with multiple dogs, usually pit bulls. And I got to tell you, the people at Front Street Animal Shelter were just tremendous in working with these animals. A lot of people will never consider coming into a triage shelter if they're separated from their canine. There's a love bond there. There's a safety bond there. But the fact of the matter is this: if a person comes with 2 dogs, that's somewhat manageable. But 7, no. It's got to be a barrier to entry. And the fact is, if you have more than 1 dog, the barrier to get into a permanent house situation is very high, and we cannot be successful. We can work with these people and we can solve some of their issues, but we're not going to get to the heart of the matter and make them successful in a stable house situation. So we've got to be mindful of that. We have to be much more nuanced about how we manage shelters. There is a place for low barrier, but until we get on top of the drug aspect, and then these other ones that I've enumerated, we will spend an awful lot of money and not get the throughput and the desired effect that we want. So, you know, there is also the ICP bed. So Emily, can you explain to people what ICP is? Because there are people with, and Councilmember Hanson alluded to this, there are people with very debilitating physical conditions. So can you explain that whole process?
Yeah, so ICP stands for Interim Care Program. It's a recuperative care program operated by WellSpace Clinic, which is a federally qualified health clinic here in our community. And it's a partnership with all 4 of the major hospital systems to provide recuperative shelter beds for folks who are being discharged from a hospital setting, but for their homelessness can't be discharged because they have wound care that needs to happen or some other kind of recuperation that can't be accommodated or isn't safe on the streets. Currently, we have, I think, 32 of those beds in our community, co-located in 2 of our traditional shelters. The people who are there receive 24-hour nursing care, case management, housing supportive services, but the entry is from the hospital system. So a lot of the folks who are medically fragile on the streets, that their entry point into ICP is through the hospitals. The good news is, just a preview something that'll be coming to you soon, is that through our whole person care program, we have the funding to add some ICP beds, and we are working very closely with WellSpace and our whole person care team to hopefully bring in the next month or so funding to add at least 20 more beds to that program, which will I think be a huge benefit to the whole community.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that sort of indicates the nuance that you have to be aware of when dealing with the homeless population. There are people with very diverse needs and very deep needs, and it takes a lot of attention and care to serve people to make them successful in housing. A lot of people criticize the Railroad Avenue shelter, but actually most of the issues that developed there were not directly attributable to the shelter. Wherever we go, and I've tried for years to find sites to do triage, 3 years to be exact, got an awful lot of no's, 1 yes. Everybody is immediately fearful of the impacts of what a triage shelter might bring to their community. And I understand the fear, I do. I get it, but I believe we've shown with Railroad that we can manage this, and we learned a lot at Railroad, so we can do even better on our next attempt. If we do nothing, as the mayor said, our population will just languish, the drug problems will get worse, the mental infirmity will not be addressed, and the physical issues, the lack of safety is tremendous. The amount of crime amongst the unhoused population it's abysmal. Most of the women who live outdoors have been raped. Many of the men have been raped. It is a very dangerous, unhappy place to be. And just as a society, we need to address it. We can't turn our back on this. It will get worse. If you look at Seattle or Portland, you'll see the rabbit hole that we are dropping into. It is crime-driven and drug-driven, and we need to have a very facile response to those 2 components of homelessness. That's about all I have to say for now. I'd like to move the staff recommendation and resolutions because we need to move this forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Harris. Councilmember Chenier.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, I'm sorry. I got Councilmember Ashby, I think, was next on the queue. It got mixed up. So go next. Go. We'll go to the old queue. Okay, then I'll get to.
Okay.
Okay, go.
And I'll take myself out so you guys can fix your queue. Thank you, Mayor. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm thrown off a little bit today because I think there might be 2 sort of understandings of what's happening here relative to the Alhambra Road site. I hear the folks from Sac High, and I am Sac High alumni, asking for a delay or a no vote. But my understanding of today's vote, and maybe Lachelle, you're the one I should ask, I'm not sure. Or Howard, one of the 2.
No, it's Emily or myself.
How could you possibly know? I haven't asked the question yet.
If it's about the Alhambra site.
How could you know?
Okay.
Reading my mind.
About the Alhambra site, sorry.
Okay, well, let's start with Howard. How about that? My question is, does this vote today move the Alhambra site forward? Because while I knew that Councilmember Chenier was holding some meetings and talking to folks, I didn't think this solidified their place in line, and I didn't think it set aside any funding particularly. The way I read the report was that it would still have to come back to council for a next approval. Am I wrong about that? Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. So what we're saying is we're prioritizing the next tranche of shelters that come online when funding becomes available. And Alhambra is in that second tier.
So it would prioritize Alhambra potentially if we got more funding later.
Correct.
But right now, we don't have funding for Alhambra.
That's
And we're
correct.
not voting on funding for Alhambra.
Correct.
So
It
before
would
we
still have
actually.
to, it would still have to come back.
Right, so that was my next question. So before we could ever move forward on Alhambra, we'd have to take another vote. And we'd have to vote to use new funding, which is not currently in this budget, to
Correct.
move Alhambra forward. Am I right?
Yes.
Lachelle, is that your reading too? Yes? Okay. So from my vantage point, I actually agree with almost everything that Councilmember Harris said, except for that I have a different end conclusion. I am not a very big supporter of the railroad site, but I agree with the things that he said about the lessons learned from it. You know, that the low barrier didn't really work. One of the days that I went out to visit the shelter, there were 90 dogs in the shelter, 90, which was just, you couldn't hear. I mean, it was just crazy. So I have tried very hard to be even though I'm skeptical, I would say, supporter of trying to do some triage somewhere, because I recognize we need to have something, some kind of triage spot. There has to be some sort of 24-hour location that SAC PD and fire and these guys can take people to. And under Boise and all those new rules, there has to be some kind of 24-hour location. I may be in the minority on this, but I am of the mind that none of those triage shelters should be in residential areas, any residential area. I don't think we should pit Oak Park and Curtis Park and Meadowview and Natomas and Del Paso, and I just don't think a residential neighborhood is the right place to be. On the other hand, I am on with the city, and I have seen folks looking for years for spots, and the more we carve out all the areas that they can't be, the harder it is to identify spots where they can be, and what is residential and what is not. But I think inside of residential, close to schools, is particularly egregious. So here we have a really important school. I went there, my own son went to the Salvation Army across the street, which was my first ask, because the Salvation Army is a place where kids go without their parents a lot, and it is directly across the street. So I will have lots of questions when this comes back before I would agree to funding, and maybe I would be alone, but I would have a ton of questions in a next round. I don't have as many questions right now because I see it as Councilmember Chenier trying to find a spot. And that spot may not even be on the table by the time we come back around, and there may be another spot that's easier or something like that. I think the Cal Expo site is far more appropriate. It has no impacts on schools. It's not close to residential. It is in an area that can be contained very easily. And I think the mayor and Councilmember Harris and the city manager did an outstanding job of finding that site, and then working hard to get it, because it had extra challenges that we probably wouldn't have gotten through without the mayor having been the former president of the Senate, because there were phone calls that needed to be made there to make that even possible. So I just want to give some assurance to Sac High that there's a whole nother process that has to happen here. And at least from this seat that I sit in and this vote, you'll have a lot of help from me in asking really difficult questions on behalf of your students, should we come to that being still at the top of the list when funding comes. But this vote today doesn't put any money towards that project. There isn't any money in this budget to move that project forward. It's just a conversation at this point. Hopefully that gives you some sense of security, and I would be happy to meet with whomever when you're done talking to Councilmember Chenier and you have a better lay of, I don't know all the details he knows, but I'm more than happy to hear the Sac High concerns as an alumni from there. So for me, that's the Sac High issue, and I just wanted it to be really clear and on the record that there's no funding in here for that today, and no decision being made to apply funding to that today, and that a vote would have to happen, would have to come back. I think it's really important that we look at subpopulations. I worry all the time that we're very broad, right? That when we do things like housing first or low barrier or whatever, that it is overly broad and we miss subpopulations. And I think when we don't focus on subpopulations, we miss the opportunity to actually be successful with our limited resources. Few things I like about today's proposal. The mayor hit some of these already. There are no new funds being added. This is the mayor's funds set aside plus the mayor's funds that he drew down from the state in HEAP or in whole person or whatever. This is us making a decision together about how to use those funds. This is not Measure U money. This is not new Measure U money. This is not ongoing general fund money. This is not an ongoing cost to the city. This is the millions we set aside there and then the millions drawn down from the state, and how we as a collective body best think that those would be used. And it's never going to be enough resources, but to the extent that we have this, how do we diversify what we're doing to reach as many subpopulations as possible? Not being a fan of Railroad Drive, I struggle a little bit with the triages, but I am supportive of Cal Expo. I wasn't here for that vote. But I am very supportive of Capitol Park, very supportive. And I want to congratulate you, Councilmember Hanson and Councilmember Harris, for starting the dialogue, and the mayor, of course, for being dogged in this. But really, Lachelle, I recognize your work here. I know you just did this with Susan Peters in the county. I think this is a fantastic model. You're using the building from the day that we start to the end. And I have seen you, I happen to be the representative for downtown when you did this with the Hotel Barry, which is similar, it's just a few blocks over. And you took everyone out of Hotel Barry and placed them in good places. And I know that I know how you do that, and I know that oftentimes for people in the situation where the residents are in Capitol Park, this is actually like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really up the ante for themselves. And so I wish we could show people how this is better for the folks that live there. But in hindsight, we will be able to. So when we come back and do reports on this a year or so out, I hope that you will include in there what happened with the placing of the 90 folks or so that are in there and how they're in a better situation now. I have no doubt that they will be. And what I love about this, Councilmember Hanson, is that you all have focused hard on a wraparound service model. And so ultimately, one of the hard things to kind of take from this point of the dais is when we create something that could potentially 8 years from now be hard to fund. But this one becomes its own entity and basically gets handed over to SHRA, where I think it belongs, and people will get the wraparound service care that they need. I think it's brilliant, and I'm thrilled to vote for it today. Even though it's taking a lot of funding on the front end, it's also going to do a lot of good. I think that is a direct correlation to how much good that project can do. And then we're also voting today to move forward on the $1 million piece, I believe, for the set aside for women and children. And I wanted to hand this out to my colleagues. There might be a few extra in here, and I'll hand them out. But in March, I as promised, I hosted a roundtable discussion. I had it in Oak Park. Councilmember Schneer's office attended as well, at the City of Refuge, and I brought in 40 providers who work with women and children specifically on homelessness, and I asked them, what are your biggest challenges to serving this population, and how could the City of Sacramento help? And then I put together this executive summary of what they told me, and I had them vote. After they told us everything that were their problems and concerns, I had them vote on what their top 10 were. That is listed in this. Far and away, for the providers who were working with women and children, their biggest concern was that women and children often need a little extra help, whether that's rental assistance or first and last month's rent, or finding a place that will take their voucher, or having a landlord that will work with them, or getting close enough to daycare, or being able to coordinate service entities like CPS with their housing provider. And so there was a big request around just filling in little gaps. It wasn't a big, huge thing. It was a whole bunch of little things. And I was really proud of all the groups that were there. You can see the groups that are listed. You will know all of them. Black Child Legacy and, Women's Empowerment and Wellspring, and the list goes on and on and on, Wind Youth Services and youth populations. And they were extremely vocal. And I think what they told us should be heeded. And so Emily and City Manager Chan, I appreciate that you have identified this document and that group's input as the basis for how you'll move forward with your $1 million for women and children. And then, Mayor, as to the scatter site model, which you know I have said I think would probably work best in my district, since I also want to work with this population, whether it is scatter site or rent assistance or just an entity that helps people meet those gaps, I think you could fairly quickly add District 1 to your list, addressing some of these needs and focusing particularly on this subpopulation, where I actually think my district has something pretty great to offer in a school district and childcares and a safe community for women and children. So
Let's start there then.
it's already in your
Discuss it.
budget, and this vote today, I think, allows us to move forward with that dialogue, and I am happy to do so. I just wanted to make sure you all had a copy of this, and that it was accounted for. And I wanted to take the last moment of my time here to say I'm going to support this. Caveat to Sac High, I'll have tough questions later. And Lachelle, thank you for stepping in and helping us, because I think we will be eminently more successful with you in a leadership role and working with the mayor and with the city manager and each of us in our council districts, me included, to be sure we're successful in these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Chenier.
So this is obviously a really difficult and complicated issue. I do believe, and I've said this many times, I think homelessness is the biggest threat we have to our community, both to our financial future and to who we are as a community and our own values as individuals sitting up on the dais and as we participate in the leadership of the city. For me, obviously, I have constituents on multiple sides of this issue on the Broadway site. I do believe that I represent folks who live in my district, whether they are homeless or not homeless. Those are all of my constituents. And we also know, and Jared, this one's for you, I don't know who's ever talked about busing people across town. The reason that we want to do it this way and put these around town is we know by experience at Railroad and national data that 80 to 85% of folks who are experiencing homelessness are experiencing homelessness in the areas either where they grew up or where they have a connection. So I don't have any desire, nor do I think we do as a city, to move people around out of their neighborhoods. What we want to do is bring the sheltering opportunities and the services to folks in the neighborhoods where they reside. I think that there's a lot of fear here and fear of the unknown. As we drive around and we see our city becoming worse with the numbers of homeless individuals, we see what's happening underneath the freeways, we see what's happening up on the parkway. We're getting a vision of what homelessness is, which in some cases is absolutely true, but in many, many cases, these are folks who are one paycheck away, or were one paycheck away, or one automobile accident, or one healthcare crisis away from becoming homeless. The national data that 40% of the people in this country don't have $400 in the bank is quite alarming, and that's how we understand people get to homelessness. There are folks with drug and alcohol problems. There are folks who have mental health issues, but there are many, many folks who are just trying to make it and can't afford their rent. And we heard that when we talked about rent control. We heard about the numbers of people who've been pushed out. We have a serious, serious problem here that we need to deal with, and we can't deal with it incrementally. We have to deal with it in a big way. I don't believe we're at the point of Portland or Seattle. I'm not sure how those communities come back from where they are. I think it will be an exponentially more difficult task for them. I think that the timing, and I want to thank the mayor and all my colleagues for getting after this, this is the time that we have to deal with this. If we don't do it now, it will only get worse, and we can't do that. So for me, it's really been a matter of looking at my own values, looking at the people that I represent across the board, and understanding that it's really imperative, I think, for us as a community to take care of those who need the most help. I think Sacramento, and one of the reasons I love Sacramento, is Sacramento has always stepped up when there's a crisis, whether it was kind of the terrorism that we had with fires in the synagogue that the mayor and I are with, whether it's been other types of issues. We need to come together and say, this is a community problem that we need to solve communally. For me then, I've tried my very best to be as transparent as possible. We don't have huge staffs, and I want to thank my staff, Allison and Jasleen and Rachel and Azia, because this issue has consumed us probably for the last 3 months. And I think that we've spent almost no time on anything else, trying to do what we thought was right with the communities that would be impacted most. I want to talk about Florin just for a minute. There were lots of challenges with the Florin site, although the reason that we've shelved it at this point is not because of Burbank High School, so I want to be clear on that. You have a few things going on there. One is it's owned by Regional Transit, and we need Federal Transit Authority approval from Washington, D.C. to do anything on that site. We're still going through the motions with them, but that's been a very difficult thing. You also, on the population center, which was a direct quote from me, that yes, this is further away. You have a line of houses and a street that directly borders the site. It's not across the street, it's not across the main boulevard, it's not a half a mile away, it's directly there. So that did weigh heavily on me for those folks who live on there. And from the beginning, I had said, if there is a better site in this area, understanding that we needed at least one site for people experiencing homelessness in the south area, I always said if there was a better site, we would move to that site at every meeting. That's the way we started. I think we do have a better site now that Mr. Carr has identified, and I'm very excited to be able to work with him and support us moving to that site. What we did, however, in the meantime, as we were looking at Florin, was we did a number of things. We had 2 large community meetings, the first one with about 100 people, the second one with about 150 people. We created an advisory committee of stakeholders from the area representing the businesses, business organizations, and the neighborhood organizations, and a lot of the prominent leaders in the community. We met twice to talk about a number of issues that were connected to it. I also had smaller meetings with the folks who lived directly next to the site. I had a large meeting with the folks who lived in the mobile home estates. So I think in Florin we probably spoke with and met with between 250 and 300 people over a month period. And that took a lot of effort from my staff to really understand what the community wanted. When we moved on to the site at Broadway, we'll just call it Broadway for now, if that's okay. When we moved on to the Broadway site, we tried to emulate the same thing. That site was identified by our city staff and brought to me. As we looked at it, within the first hour, we called St. Hope, we called Salvation. I personally called St. Hope, Salvation Army, Greater Sacramento Urban League, Asian Chamber of Commerce, the Sierra Curtis Neighborhood Association, which is actually directly across the block, Curtis Park, across Broadway from the site, the Greater Broadway Business Partnership, the Newton booth, Mr. Hansen helped me with that, the Alhambra Triangle folks. So we called everyone and said, this is what's going on. We're going to have a community meeting. We did it in Curtis Park. That was the easiest place to do it, and the room was the right size. We had 180 people show up, and we went through 2 hours of questions and answers from that meeting. I've also met with a number of other folks. We did the same thing as we did in Florin. We established an advisory committee, again, representing all of the folks. As I said, 3 individuals from St. Hope was there. I think we actually asked to have it at your place. but didn't get a response on that.
I asked to meet with you first.
Yeah. So that's we're good. But I don't think, and I've been working with St. Hope for 12 years now, I don't think I've ever said no when there's been any kind of request to work with the school in any way, shape, or form. There's no bigger youth advocate than and I would never do anything that I think would purposely put youth in harm's way. And so we have continued to work on establishing a larger meeting. We have, I believe, a meeting with the principals of the St. Hope schools, the other schools in the area that we work with, and other youth-providing organizations set up for the first week in May. We have plenty of time to have all of these discussions, and the purpose of that meeting will really be to understand what the concerns are of the principals as they represent their schools. We'll continue, and I've met with a number of individuals one-on-one. It's a site that I drive by every day and look at the numbers of folks who are in there. It is really an uncontrolled site. And I think that as we think about going forward here on this site, one is you all have my commitment and everyone in the neighborhood to meet and confer about this, to talk about what issues we have, what issues we can control. I want to say again, the folks that we're really targeting for this shelter, which is along the Broadway WX corridor down to the river and up Highway 80, those are the folks that we want to put in this shelter. Those are the folks that are in your neighborhoods now. Those are the folks that may be causing problems now if there are problems from homeless individuals. So we want to get some control over that and give them the services they need to put their lives on the right order. We just took a quick look at 311 calls in the city. In March, there were 436 311 calls in the city. 125 of them, or 28%, were from that corridor that I just described, going towards the river and up Highway 80. It's over a quarter of the calls we got from 311 last month were from that area. That's the area that we need to provide services. That's the area that we want to take a look at. So I think that, as Ms. Ashby said, we're not voting on money today. What we're doing is basically providing direction for the city manager to continue discussions. I'm going to continue to do that. I will say the same thing I said about Florin. If there is a better site, let's find it. And if you can identify a site, I'm all for it. I've tried other ones. I don't think, certainly in my district, as I think through the district, I don't know that there's a site not within a quarter mile or half a mile of a school in the district. So I'm happy to work together to look at it. This is something that we need to solve together. And frankly, I do think this can be a great educational experience for our young people. When we talked with the Florin folks, we asked kids if they knew other young people who were homeless at their school. The answer was absolutely yes. I'm sure it's the same at Sac High and some of the other schools in our neighborhoods that we need to work with. I will say that a couple of things we've learned that I would recommend for Cal Expo or whatever, Ethan, whatever we're calling that. The advisory committee is a worthwhile endeavor. It brings stakeholders together on an ongoing basis to take a look. The other thing we've done, and we'll certainly share it with everyone, is developed a good neighbor policy that we have passed out both to the folks at Florin and the folks at Broadway to take a look at and offer recommendations so we can make sure that everyone understands what's going on. For this site, I want to end with what Bob Dutra said. So Bob is Bob's glass. Bob is not happy about this going in, but when the mayor asked him what was going on at his site, he said it was horrible. We need to get some control over that site, and I think it can be better when we look at additional police services, when we look at additional solid waste pickup, when we look at a downtown streets team, when we look at the other pieces of the puzzle that we're bringing along with these sites. We're not just building a roof, we're building a roof with services, with adults who are trained to work with homeless individuals. That creates a different atmosphere, and I think we can do that. I get more complaints, and I think Mr. Hansen is right there with me, about people sleeping under the freeways along the WX corridor. I think it's the number one thing that we need to deal with. It is the entrances to the city. We need to do this for those individuals, and I believe very, very sincerely that we need to do this also for the communities around them. I want to support both of the recommendations that came from Midtown about kind of a direct referral process and also on the fencing, so if we can look at those things as we move forward. So that's it on Broadway. A couple of quick comments on some of the other pieces. You know, on the scattered site, and if we can get, if Ms. Ashby is willing to do this and we can find it, I do want us to think about the finances on this. When I've talked to the county, they basically went into distressed neighborhoods to get their scattered sites. So it wasn't very expensive. I just think we need to look at the costs of what they're doing if we're going into, and I think these should be spread around the city, but if we're going into neighborhoods that are going to cost us a lot more, if we're losing the ability to serve volume, that's a problem for me. So if we can.
Just one comment on that is, so the numbers in the staff report came directly from the operator, and I did ask him what would it take to go into more affluent areas or more areas where the rental market. So this does reflect a slight ratchet up in the lease rates as compared to what they're paying in the county, but I do agree that this might be a moving target based on what we are actually able to acquire.
So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I just, as I've said before on many items, we need to look at the data. We need to be cognizant of what we're spending and why.
Mayor, if I could, can I just say one thing to Councilmember Schneer? I agree with you wholeheartedly, because if we're going to pay more for a place, say out in my district, then there needs to be some economy of scale, like maybe it has 5 bedrooms or something and it can serve multiple families, or we focus on the low-income inclusionary apartment complexes, of which there are 11 in my district. So of course the rents are lower in a portion of those units than the rest of the community. But you have my commitment as we look at how I can solve for this in my district to take that in mind. And I agree with your analysis. We wouldn't want to spend more to help one family if we could help 10 for that same amount and look at different neighborhoods. Thank you.
So the only other thing is, I know that after having many, many conversations with Regional Transit about this, particularly because of the Florence site, we do want to do something about transit at all these sites, and RT is very open to working with us on that to get some good fares. If we want to buy passes for people, we want to make sure they can get to wherever they need to go on regional transit. So that's my thing. I'm support the motion as we move forward. And Jake, however you want to do this, let's get down and talk with your kids and talk with your parents. Happy to do that. And again, if there is a better site in District 5, let me know. I'm happy to go visit it anytime, day or night. Thank you.
Jay, thank you for your consistent, steadfast leadership on these sets of issues. You've spent untold numbers of hours.
No, I know how many.
Well, told, and taken a lot of the slings to try to do the right thing and help people in your district. And I just want to say I appreciate it. Councilmember Hansen, again, a thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to thank my colleagues and the public for what I think is one of the best and most substantive conversations on a difficult issue we could have had. And the fact that we had the folks from St. Hope here, the students and teachers, I think is a healthy opportunity to engage not only in the civil dialogue of these kind of things, but also just to lay out the complexity of trying to help people in a complicated way. And I'll second Mr. Harris's motion because it hasn't been seconded yet. But there's always this temptation in these fights to sort of dehumanize folks from both sides. And I think, I'm sorry Nikki and Kevin Boltz and others left because they came in after I talked about the relocation plan. But we're trying very hard not to do that in these conversations. And one of the people on my mind, Mr. Mayor, and with your indulgence in the council, I'd like to talk about Frank Topping for a second, because I'd like to adjourn this session in his honor. Frank is an advocate who came here for many years. I knew him before I got elected. I think I first met him when I moved to Alkali Flat in 2007. And I moved from 33rd and W, where I lived right after my dad died. I bought my first house over there. And I only could do that because my dad died. You know, so it's a very, there's a very strong connection in my heart to the neighborhood that St. Hope is in, partially because it has that connection for me. But Frank, I got to know, he was on the Mental Health Services Board for the county. He was frequently here talking about the need to help people. And he himself had his challenges and travails. He passed away about a month ago, but we just found out because he sort of disappeared. And that is something that, well, Frank wasn't homeless. He had his struggles, and we see people who come to council regularly, and we come to know them, even across the dais. And whether they're housed or unhoused, we form a bond, even when it's hard sometimes to figure out what to do. And so I think, you know, and Councilmember Chenier and Councilmember Ashby and myself, we care about the neighborhood, and I will do what I can to help as well. You certainly don't need more cooks in the kitchen. But I do think there's a really there's like an alchemy that can be done here, where I think through participation in the conversation, through the work that Councilmember Chenier is doing, and you've done yeoman's work. And when I was living in the neighborhood, we had homeless folks that were constantly a challenge for the residents. But as I drove back and forth from McGeorge, where I worked for a couple years and went to school, I saw this particular area where the WX shelter is being proposed constantly impacted. And there's no doubt that having them inside would be better, but having them outside in the neighborhood poses a lot more challenges, and that's not lost on any of you. But in this challenge of how we help people, I just encourage everyone to see each other. The Capitol Park Hotel site, I think, is an innovation, and I got an email, Mayor, from Dan Kim, who's the director of DGS, about the Capitol Park Hotel site, because he was working for Mayor Newsom at the time. He said this is very similar to the Mayor Newsom's efforts to use SROs and master leasing to do a very similar thing that has become the triage model. And so I want to thank you for pressing that, for Councilmember Harris for pressing that, because this is a brave new world for the city of Sacramento, but is well-trod ground for other major cities. And, you know, as much as this is new for us, we are not the first. And I think we can learn a lot from those other places, and maybe it's population selection to answer some of the concerns, but we ultimately, and this is the real rub, people want us to do something, but if we have nowhere to do it, we can't accomplish anything. It's not going to be inexpensive, and that's why getting the state monies and the private dollars that you've been able to leverage, Mayor, are important. But we are charged with, and it is the number one complaint I get, the number one source of frustration is, can't you just move them? Can't you just do something? Well, no, we can't. Our hands are mostly tied. This is one of the very few things that we can do, that the law supports, that the community wants, and everybody wants it to happen, they just don't want it to happen near them. And that is a reflection of the human condition that I think will continue to be part of who we are as a species. But I think this is also an opportunity for us to transcend that conundrum, that catch-22, and really show people that we can make a difference. And I think to know the change that can happen, to be firsthand, and Mayor, you asked the question, are you engaged in homeless services, to the young woman who is very articulate from St. Hope? And I think that's interesting. I don't know that she wants to do that or that other people will, but I think there is an opportunity to break down those barriers and let people get to know each other in their adversity to create that alchemy that leaves people better off. And so I'm happy to support the item. I think this is really a good thing that we're doing. Will it be perfect? Will there be some answer past year 3? You know, that's to come. The tier 2 sites, you know, those are aspirational sort of at this point because of funding, but we have a path, and we have a destination that we're trying to go to, and I hope we get there soon.
Thank you. Thank you again for your leadership on this, Councilmember Hanson. Councilmember Guerra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. First, I'm going to be supporting this motion because I know myself how difficult it is to find an actual site. We aggressively, with our own business improvement districts and the city staff, have been trying to look for something in District 6. I do want to thank Emily for working with our office and also Sacramento Self-Help Housing to look at options for scattered sites and how could that work in District 6. And they, Patty Eplinger, who also lives in my district and has been working for Sacramento Self-Help Housing, has been also very thoughtful about how can we do this and that option. So I want to thank you for that. But it's been challenging to find sites, and when we have found locations and properties that we thought might work out, they were sold, and we would lose out on those opportunities. And so I think it's keeping the momentum moving forward is critical because the fact is, number one, particularly like driving down this area on X Street, I used to ride my bike down to downtown and until we had our son, and now I'm dropping him off, but I want to get back onto riding downtown with him. When you ride down that street, I mean, that's all you see is an uncontrolled situation. There's needles, there's trash, there's broken bottles. It's an uncontrolled area. And going down there by myself, that's one thing, but now if I want to actually do that, we need to figure out a way to control that area. There's a lot of frustration, and I've brought this up to Lachelle Dozier about the situation that's happening in San Juan Motel property site. It's an uncontrolled area. It's out of control. We have to figure out how to manage these locations. So I'm very sensitive of the issue of trying to find a site. I'm also concerned about, if the school district is having these issues. So, Councilmember Chenier, your comments about a commitment to sit down with the principals and the families to figure out if this site isn't a viability, how it would work, where it would work, and what we could do. But the status quo is you see needles on the street, and kids are walking through that area already. And that's my big concern too, and my urgency to finding locations and sites is because I get calls and complaints about needles at our regional parks, at our normal parks, in the street when walking. And if we want to encourage a community where young kids are out on their bikes and playing with their friends, we just can't have that. And that's a byproduct of not dealing with the capacity issue of moving there. So I'm supportive of the scattered sites, and hopefully we could do them, but scattered sites aren't going to get us to where we need to go. I want to thank Mercy Housing because while this may seem new, it's completely not new to Sacramento. The boulevards over on Stockton Boulevard is an old motel that is not too far from where I live, where was a problem motel all the time. And ever since Mercy Housing came in, it's completely changed. And so it's not a new concept to Sacramento. I'm glad we're doing it. I'm glad we're doing it at the scale as we're doing in Capitol Park, because I think that in Councilmember Hanson, I think your leadership in moving that is critical. And so in my district, we've worked a lot with Mercy. I remember when that was going through in the neighborhood association. Also, we have St. John's in the area. That helps a lot of women and families who are looking for help. And Mr. City Manager, I hope we can continue this conversation because I know that was a reason why we were putting together the budget proposal to make sure that we could look at the support for organizations like St. John's that's in my district, or Community Against Sexual Harm, that are helping some of the women who are victims of prostitution and are also facing the issue of homelessness, making sure that we're finding resources for them. But in the bigger picture, it's difficult to find locations, and so the more we can do to move this forward and figure out how we can find those locations, I'm going to be very supportive of that. I want to make sure we're sensitive to kids, but I do want to say that I will oppose any proposal that forces shelters only in non-residential areas. We have to look at every option because it's so difficult. And if we were to do that, that means they would go all to District 6, or likely District 2. And that means Avondale and Glen Elder would bear the brunt again on issues of forcing everything in those areas. So I want to make sure that we look at all options in every area, but to say, you know, I don't want it to, in my backyard, it's a difficult thing. It's tough to find. I know I've had the challenge of finding one, but I want to make sure that we look at the entire city because it's a city problem. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Garrett. Councilmember Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to be brief. First of all, my colleagues, I want to just say, I know this is a very difficult situation, but I know we're moving with the right intentions, and trying to find locations in all of these districts will continue to be a challenge, which we knew going in, and was one of the reasons why I made some of the early statements about District 2. However, I remain committed in District 2 that we will do our part to continuing to help with this issue. I want to make sure, though, as it relates to the issue around St. Hope, and the St. Hope issue is not on the agenda for action currently. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I think I heard Councilman Chenier say he was going to again reach out to the St. Hope folks to set up a meeting to try to hopefully work through some of the concerns that they have should the site that's in question relative to St. Hope continue to be a targeted area for sprung shelters or any type of homeless shelter. So
That's what I heard too, yes.
all right, so I just
And I think he's already formed a community advisory
I
committee.
know,
so-
and we know Jay, we can take him at his word that he's going to do that. I know he's continued to do that, so. So I'm going to support as well. I think we're going to have a unanimous vote, Mr. Mayor. But I do think it's important that these tough discussions have to be had. We have to continue to respect these communities, have the discussions, and hopefully we bring in more people to the discussions and we relieve them of some of their concerns, because this will not go away. It's going to be an issue in every community. There will be people like the folks we heard today that will continually come out and speak. So, and we have to prove to them that we're going to do the things we said we're going to do and help make this situation work. So with that, I will turn the mic back over to you, sir.
I'll close here and just thank everybody, the members of the public, for coming out today on a school day, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience, all my colleagues and everyone. I just want to end on a couple of notes. Number one, just to tell you the trajectory here, I want to add up the beds that are in the mix here, okay? 100 beds, Ethan Way, up to 180 beds with Capitol Park, 100 to 200 beds in South Sacramento, I'll call it 200. 160 beds that we are going to convert existing shelter beds into triage with the much more assertive effort with case management and mental health and substance abuse services to move people through much faster than the current shelter system is moving people through. That is even without the site we're talking about here, 640 beds. The goal here, and it'll be imperfect, is to move people through every 4 months. And think about the magnitude of this. If we can get 800 beds and move people through every 4 months, that's 2,400 people a year we can move off the streets. That is not only worthy, it's necessary and it's essential. I think the debate really is best summed up by two things I heard by Mr. Dutra, who was frustrated and angry, and even something Councilmember Ashby said, which I want to talk about. Mr. Dutra, when I asked him, as Jay said a moment ago, I asked him, how bad is it now for your business? It's really bad, he said. And Councilmember Ashby said, when it comes to the difficulty of finding sites, the more sites we take off the table because of neighborhood concerns, the fewer sites we have to then try to deal with the problem. And yet, the community is more angry if we're not doing something aggressive about this. And so I know that Jay will work with the good people at St. Hope here and with the entire community to make sure that this is right. And maybe it is not all low barrier triage, as Jeff Harris said a moment ago. And I would challenge you, though, if it's not low barrier triage, and to participate in good faith and help make something good happen. I had an interesting experience. I just want to end with this out in Councilmember Ashby's district. I'm going to, not picking on you, Angelique, I'm just telling a story about a few weeks ago when I was out in your district at a school. I think it was it Natomas Charter? It was a Natomas Charter, and was with a lot of high school students who were presenting to me, and Angelique's staff was out there, who were presenting to me their projects, what they wanted to see different about the city. And we go back and forth a little bit on this homeless issue, and she's made herself, you know, her point of view clear, and she's supportive and trying to do it in her way, which is good. The vast majority of those young people said the one thing they want different about this city is for us to solve homelessness out in Natomas. And I wonder if we had the same project at St. Hope, I bet you the results would be the same. And I bet you they'd be the same across the city, at every school, because young people see this and they want it to be better. So you've come to register your concerns, which I respect, but now it's time to work to make something positive and good happen. Working with the council member who, you're darn right, has been a youth advocate his entire life. And so I have very mixed feelings about it. You came and exercised your absolute right, and on behalf of the kids you serve, and I respect that. And on the other hand, now that that's on the table, no is not a sufficient answer, especially given the geographical issues that Jay talked about earlier in terms of the area of town. 28% of those 311 calls in March of 2018 are proximate to the St. Hope schools. Let's make that better together and make a better city along the way. Call for the vote, please. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstain. That's a unanimous vote. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. We are adjourned. We're in recess until 5 o'clock.